They met on the ragged coastline of Essos, beneath a sky streaked by pastel shades of dawn. Neither had expected their paths to cross, not in those early hours before the tide turned, not before the gulls took flight and the sailors roused themselves to the day's work. Daenerys stood upon the stony shore, her silver-gold hair drifting in the wind, her dragons perched on craggy outcroppings behind her. She felt their warmth and ancient breath upon her back, reassuring her of her strength. Jon arrived after a voyage full of perils he could scarcely have imagined, his stark armor battered but still serviceable, the dust of many leagues still clinging to his boots. He was tired, carrying the weight of the North and the Night's Watch in his dark eyes. They knew each other's names. One heard tell of the Dragon Queen who had freed slaves and marched with Unsullied, whose dragon soared over foreign skies. The other, a king in the North that united wildlings and men sworn to the Watch, the quiet bastard of Winterfell who'd risen from death to become more than anyone suspected. They discovered common cause in their need to protect the world from an otherworldly threat, though at first that bond was fragile and unspoken. Yet from the moment Daenerys turned and saw Jon's face, pale with exhaustion yet lit by that faint glimmer of hope, she felt a pang of recognition, like meeting a long-lost companion whose spirit mirrored her own. He bowed to her, not quite certain if she would demand the same knee-bent fealty she had requested of others. But she did not. Instead, she extended her hand quietly, thoughtfully, as though there were something more intimate and essential in this simple gesture than all the lavish ceremonies of her youth. The dragons spread their wings, winged gusting salt spray through the air. Their roars shook the rocks, a warning to any who might threaten their mother. Jon did not falter, though his mind raced, memory flickering back to the terror of the White Hunts, the flight from the cold undead. He bowed his head in greeting, and the words he offered were measured, spoken with that northern lilt. They talked as two who have fought lonely battles, each burdened by the knowledge that the dangers across the sea, beyond the wall, and in the councils of lords were too vast for either one alone. The others watched from a distance, Tyrion, who weighed the implications of such an encounter, Sir Davos, who listened with hope that these two might truly become allies, Missandei, who stood by Daenerys' side, her calm presence encouraging diplomacy and understanding. With the hush of the morning tide, a new bond began. There were differences, distrust that still lingered in Jon's heart regarding Targaryens, the last memories of his father's rebellion, the terrible stories of wildfire. For Daenerys, there was an echo of pride, a feeling that the rightful king in the North should bow to her as the true heir of the Seven Kingdoms. Yet something in the sincerity of Jon's eyes unsettled all her old demands for kneeling. There was a gentleness in him, yes, but also a ferocity born of purpose. She recognized in his voice a quiet acceptance of the burdens of leadership, a matching of her own sense of responsibility. Just as she had freed the slaves of Slaver's Bay, bringing justice where none was found, he had opened the gates of the wall to the free folk and fought for their survival, believing that no man, woman, or child deserved to die on the wrong side of an arbitrary border. They were both outsiders, shaped by the needs of people who had once viewed them with distrust or hatred. Those first encounters on the shoreline and later in the halls of a fortress in Essos, where Daenerys had set up temporary court before deciding on her sail for Westeros, were filled with tension and the swirl of rumor. Soldiers and advisors saw the possibilities. A dragon queen, a northern king, an alliance that could subdue the fractured lords of the Seven Kingdoms before the war against the Night King began in earnest. Tyrion, always cunning, was quick to suggest the possibility of a marriage. He presented it politely, going so far as to mention historical precedents, alliances sealed by unions that had brought peace and prosperity. Yet Daenerys bristled at first, not wanting to be sold or used for the sake of politics. Her entire life had been about throwing off the shackles of men who believed they could trade her as a pawn. Jon, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, having never considered a wedding under such circumstances. He was not Robb, to break a vow lightly. He was not a man who even believed himself worthy of a queen's bed. And if he were to marry, it would be for something more than mere politics. Still, The thought ignited a flicker deep inside both their chests, something that made their gazes linger a heartbeat longer than courtesy demanded. The morning after Tyrion first broached the idea, Daenerys found herself walking alone along the ramparts of that coastal fortress, staring at the endless horizon of the sea. She thought of all the lives she had touched, the loyalty of her armies, the freedmen who called her Misa, and the quiet vow she had made to break the wheel that had ground so many innocents beneath its turning. But she also felt the memory of loneliness. She had lost her beloved Khal Drogo, a marriage that started as a barter and had ended in a fiery love that once seemed to consume her entire being. And then Daario Naharis had been a companion of sorts, though she had left him behind in Meereen, feeling that her destiny required a more strategic path. She was uncertain that love would or could ever be the guiding principle of her life. And yet, when she recalled the sight of Jon Snow standing in the dawnlight, something stirred in her she did not expect. She turned at the sound of measured footsteps on the stones. Jon approached, his cloak shifting about his shoulders. Dawn had fully broken now, and the new day smelled of brine and promise. His expression was somber, yet something in his eyes softened when he saw her. He spoke quietly, in that earnest tone that never seemed to waver with embellishment or half-truths. He told her that Tyrion had spoken with him as well, that perhaps it was wise to consider the proposition. Yet he clarified he would not insult her by assuming she would say yes merely for convenience. She thanked him, somewhat stiffly, unsure how to bridge that space between her reticence and her own desire for a deeper bond that might, just might, become something real. She asked him about the north, about the long winters and the faces carved into weirwood trees. He responded not as a politician, but as a son who remembers snow-draped courtyards and the quiet hush that descends at night when the wind carries the howling of wolves. She found herself envisioning a place so different from the sweltering deserts and bright, scorched cities of Essos. He told her of the northern lords, proud and unyielding, men and women who had spent generations preparing for storms. Daenerys felt her mind wandering into that world, imagining the swirl of snow around her dragons, the hiss of their breath as they melted drifts into steam. It was in that moment she knew how to secure the hearts of those in the north. Jon had said there were many who would never bend the knee to a Targaryen. Their memories were long, their grudges heavy. But Daenerys believed that if she were accepted as one of them, if she, like the Stark kings of old, pledged herself to protect the realm from the horrors beyond the wall, perhaps the wounds of the past could begin to heal. The conversation lingered, carried by the wind, filled with earnest admissions of what each of them wanted. They wanted to save the realm from the Whites and the Night King. They wanted to break the tyrannies and injustices that had plagued Westeros for so long. And they admitted, in soft, hesitant words, that they did not want to do it alone. News of their betrothal spread before either of them had fully decided the details. Tyrion, seeing the advantage of proclaiming a union between the king in the north and the Dragon Queen, spoke in private to Varys and Sir Davos. He told them that a marriage would bring unity faster than any forced oath. Sir Davos, for his part, saw hope in Daenerys, a queen who genuinely cared for her people, reminiscent in some ways of the better qualities Hyde witnessed in Stannis before that king's downfall. So the rumors took root and blossomed, and by the time Daenerys and Jon realized how thoroughly the idea had been woven into the minds of their closest advisors, they found themselves on the cusp of an arranged ceremony. At first, Daenerys resisted, not because she disliked Jon, quite the opposite in fact, but she feared the idea that once again her path to power was being orchestrated by others, that she would become a symbol rather than a sovereign. Yet every time she saw Jon, he was sincere. He did not press her or attempt to manipulate her. Instead, in those spaces between the demands of rule, they spoke as two people who had grown up apart from the rest of the world. He confessed that he always felt like an outsider in Winterfell, never truly a Stark, that the words bastard still rang in his ears. She told him how she had been hunted across the sea, forced to flee from city to city, dependent on the kindness of her brother's allies. Their hearts opened in increments, forging a bond that neither expected. By the time Daenerys realized she had come to value Jon's presence more than any vow of fealty from the north, she understood that there might be something more in this union than mere strategy. The ceremony took place in Essos, in the courtyard of that fortress by the sea, with dragons circling overhead. It was not nearly as grand as the wedding of a queen who strove for the Iron Throne might have had in King's Landing. Instead, it was intimate and almost stark in its solemnity, a reflection of the North. Missandei presided over many of the details, ensuring that the rites included both Targaryen and Northern customs, weaving them into a unique tapestry that spoke of their mutual respect. Jon arrived in a clean set of black leather and fur, the Stark sigil carefully stitched in silver thread at his shoulders. Daenerys wore a pale white gown embroidered with 3 small dragons running down the sleeves. Neither looked fully comfortable in this ceremonial finery, but there was a serenity in their eyes when they took each other's hands. Tyrion watched with a calculating gaze, aware of the political ramifications. Ser Davos stood close to Jon, a paternal pride in his expression. Grey Worm and the Unsullied stood in silent formation, a sign of loyalty and respect for their queen. A few gathered Dothraki looked on as well, murmuring quietly about the significance of this union. Amidst it all, Varys smiled faintly, never betraying his deeper thoughts. The wedding vows were spoken in hushed tones, echoing softly against the ancient stone walls. Daenerys promised to stand with Jon against all the storms that would come, from the harshest winter to the greatest foe. Jon pledged to defend her and her people as if they were his own, to uphold the ideals she had laid out when she spoke of freedom. They sealed the vow in the presence of both realms, East and West, forging a single family dedicated to saving the world from terrors that lurked beyond the horizon. After the ceremony, there was feasting, though it was modest compared to the lavish banquets of Meereen or the feudal halls of the North. Wine was poured, bread was broken, and the dragons roared from the ramparts above, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Daenerys and Jon stole a moment away, drifting to the far side of the courtyard, where a turret overlooked the glittering sea. There, the crashing waves below reminded them of the vastness of the world they meant to save. They spoke in whispers about what came next, the plan to sail for Westeros, to rally the lords, and to prepare the realm for the war against the dead. Daenerys leaned into Jon, the warmth of him a steady reassurance in the cool evening air. And for a time, they spoke not of politics, not of war, but of the simplest things. The sound of the ocean, the feeling of a new bond that might truly be more than an alliance. When they parted, the moon was high, and both knew that something profound and irreversible had taken root between them. Their departure from Essos was a grander affair than the wedding. Hundreds of ships, gathered from the Ironborn loyal to Daenerys, and from the combined forces of the North, were prepared to set sail. The Dothraki, many of whom had never stepped foot on a ship before, showed both excitement and trepidation. The Unsullied were stoic, as always, forming organized lines as they boarded. Daenerys dragons soared above, their silhouettes cutting across the sky. The fleet was a sight to behold, bearing the combined sigils of House Targaryen, a 3-headed dragon, and that of the Wolf of House Stark. The Queen and King stood together on the flagship, the sea breeze rippling Daenerys' pale braids and tugging at the fur trim of Jon's cloak. Before the anchor was raised, Daenerys allowed herself one final moment to gaze at the land she was leaving behind, a place where she had grown from a timid girl into a conqueror and liberator. Memories played out in her mind. Khal Drogo leading the Khalasar across the Red Waste, the city of Korth and its illusions, Astapor, and the day she gained her Unsullied. She recalled Meereen, where she had learned the difficulties of ruling. All of that had culminated in this departure, in which she returned to the home she had never truly known, but had always been taught to long for. She glanced at Jon, and in his eyes, she saw not fear but acceptance of the path they would walk together. Their journey westward began with the thunder of oars dipping into the sea, the snap of sails catching the wind, and the roar of dragons overhead. The crossing was not smooth. Storms battered the fleet, driving some ships off course and necessitating stops at small, rocky islands. The Dothraki, seasick and ill at ease on the decks, grew restless, but Grey Worm and the Unsullied managed to keep order. Tyrion's mind was never at rest, constantly accounting for provisions, morale, and rumors that might unsettle this delicate alliance. Sir Davos advised Jon on the temperament of lords they would soon face, reminding him of the still raw tensions. Missandei kept the Queen informed of messages from both Essos and secret channels in Westeros that Varys had maintained. Through it all, Daenerys and Jon made time for each other in the captain's cabin, an oasis of relative calm where they exchanged quiet words of support, or simply sat by the flickering lantern light, analyzing maps and discussing the future of the realm. It was during one such candlelit conversation that the topic of the Iron Throne emerged more seriously. Daenerys spoke of the oath she made to free the Seven Kingdoms from those who would oppress and harm them. Jon reminded her that many lords might not yield easily, and some still remembered the Mad King's atrocities. The mention of her father's madness never sat comfortably with Daenerys, but she listened. He counseled that showing mercy and fairness would be the key to earning lasting loyalty, not just fear. She admitted that she had not crossed the narrow sea to be queen of ash and bone. She wanted a realm built on justice. They spoke at length about the complexities of dealing with Cersei Lannister, who still clung to the Iron Throne in King's Landing, about the Tyrells, the Martells, and the fractured alliances that had emerged in the wake of the War of the Five Kings. In the hush that followed, they confronted the deeper question. Once they dealt with these earthly conflicts, how would they unify the realm against the Night King? Jon described the threat in harrowing detail. The White Walkers, the Whites, the necrotic hush that fell across the land when the army of the dead advanced. Daenerys felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean winds. She placed her hand in Jon's, feeling a tremor as she imagined undead armies marching south. She had been so focused on seizing the Iron Throne, on fulfilling her destiny, that the monstrous reality of what Jon had seen hit her with renewed force. The conversation ended with a silent agreement. They would do whatever it took to defend life, forging alliances even with old enemies if necessary. That night, a greater sense of purpose bound them as they lay in the swaying cabin, the thunder of waves reminding them that their battles would be fought on many fronts. Eventually, the storms passed, and the coast of Westeros emerged on the horizon like a brooding shadow. Daenerys found herself leaning over the ship's railing, heart pounding as she caught sight of the land she had only heard of in stories. The cliff faces were imposing, the grasses a dull green that reminded her of the precarious nature of the climate here. Jon stood beside her, pointing out landmarks. Bear Island lay farther north, the imposing fortress of Storm's End to the south. She watched his expression, seeing the mixture of nostalgia and apprehension in his eyes as the place of his birth came into view. The dragons, sensing land, flew ahead in sweeping arcs. Their roars echoed against the cliffs, announcing to Westeros that the Age of Dragons had returned. Word of the Dragon Queen's arrival spread swiftly along the coast. Ravens flew to the major seats of power, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach, the Westerlands. Whispers circulated that she did not come alone. She had married the king in the north. Some scoffed. Some trembled. Some rejoiced. Few had anticipated such a union, and fewer still knew what to make of it. But it did not take long for those with ambition or fear to muster their forces. Cersei Lannister in King's Landing bristled at the news, her paranoia sharpened by the combined threat of a Targaryen with dragons and a Stark who had already once risen against the crown. Yet she had no intention of yielding. She sent her own ravens, calling upon alliances, promising gold and power to those who would stand against the invaders. Meanwhile, in the north, Sansa Stark and Arya Stark, Jon's sisters, awaited the return of their brother with mingled relief and wariness. They had heard rumors of this mother of dragons, but they did not fully understand what sort of woman she was. Sansa had learned to be cautious of new alliances, to expect betrayal around every corner. Daenerys and Jon landed at Dragonstone first, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen. Setting foot on the black sand beach felt like stepping into a lost memory for Daenerys. The jagged stone castle perched upon volcanic cliffs, dark and foreboding, yet also regal in its architecture. It was here that her ancestors had first come to Westeros. She walked the halls with a certain awe, imagining the footsteps of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters. Jon stood with her, respectful, though the gloom of the place made him uneasy. Ghost, who had followed him to Essos and on the ships, padded beside him silently, sniffing at the air with caution. The dragons explored the island skies, perching on the high towers as if reclaiming an ancient roost. While Tyrion, Varys, and Missandei began establishing Daenerys' court in the castle's hall, Jon turned his thoughts northward. The ravens he sent to Winterfell returned with uncertain news. Sansa and Arya were there, but tensions with some of the lords remained high. They were reluctant to accept a Targaryen queen, even one who had married Jon. Jon and Daenerys both knew they could not delay. Winter was coming, and the threat beyond the wall loomed over them all. Yet they also understood that to face that threat, they needed a stable southern front. So they planned carefully. Daenerys was not eager to set King's Landing aflame, repeating the horrors her father once threatened, but she also recognized that if Cersei would not relinquish power, blood would be spilled. Over the coming weeks, Jon dispatched envoys to Winterfell, explaining why he had taken a Targaryen bride, emphasizing the unity it would bring. Daenerys, for her part, sent messages to lords across the realm, reminding them of her promise to liberate and offer justice, not tyranny. The replies varied. Some noble houses were intrigued. Others remained hostile or silent. Daenerys found herself impatient. She had grown accustomed to cities that surrendered or were overtaken by her dragons in a rush of fire. But now, she had promised Jon and herself that she would not become a queen of ashes. She wanted to be seen as a liberator, not a conqueror. It was a delicate balance, made more difficult by the cunning of Cersei Lannister, who waged a quiet war of whispers and sabotage. In the nights that followed, as they shared the ancient chambers of Dragonstone, Daenerys would sometimes wake from uneasy dreams. She would see visions of a frozen battlefield, the undead swarming across fields of white, corpses of men and dragons alike. She would sit up, breath unsteady, and Jon would reach out, pulling her close. He never offered platitudes, never told her it was all right if it wasn't. Instead, he would simply hold her until her breathing settled. They both knew that the war was coming, and their only hope was to unite the living before the dead arrived. On some nights, he would tell her the old stories of the Long Night, of the last hero who fought back the darkness. Daenerys listened, absorbing the legends even as she shivered at the prospect of this new battle. Soon, the time came to move. Daenerys led a portion of her forces northward while leaving a garrison at Dragonstone. Jon rode by her side, flanked by a small retinue of northern knights and Dothraki riders who had grown curious about the land of constant cold. The roads were treacherous, the cold biting at the foreign soldiers, unaccustomed to such a climate. Yet Daenerys pressed on, determined to show that she was not frightened by the north. The first major stop was the seat of House Stark. Approaching Winterfell, Daenerys felt both excitement and trepidation. She had heard of the greatness of House Stark, of their sense of honor, but also their fierce independence. The gates opened as they drew near, revealing a courtyard filled with men, women, and children, gathered to see the arrival of two monarchs. One of them a queen they'd heard only rumors about, the other their own king in the north. Sansa stood upon the steps of the great hall, her auburn hair wrapped in a thick fur cloak. Next to her was Arya, slight but with an intensity in her gaze that surprised Daenerys. Behind them stood the northern lords, solemn, silent. And near the back, Brienne of Tarth, her imposing figure radiating a protective presence. Jon dismounted first, stepping forward to greet his sisters. The warmth in his voice when he said their names was matched by the quiet relief in their eyes. Embraces were exchanged. Then he turned and introduced Daenerys. Sansa's expression remained guarded, her mouth tight with politeness. She dipped her head, acknowledging the new queen, but Daenerys sensed the tension. Arya, however, studied Daenerys with a cool curiosity, as though evaluating her for potential threat or worthiness. The crowd in the courtyard murmured, as one of Daenerys' dragons soared overhead, its shadow sweeping across the snow-covered parapets. In the great hall, the lords greeted Daenerys with cautious formality. Lyanna Mormont, the young lady of Bear Island, spoke for many when she questioned how this Targaryen queen would serve the North's interests. Daenerys responded calmly, stating that she came not to subjugate but to protect and to bring peace. She told of her experiences in Essos, freeing the enslaved, and made a point of mentioning that she would do anything to keep the realm safe from the horrors beyond the wall. Jon confirmed her words, reminding them all of the monstrous threat approaching from the far north. The mention of the Night King and the White Walkers served to cool some of the hostility. Even so, Sansa locked eyes with Jon, and he understood that he would need to speak with her privately. That evening, while Daenerys was shown to chambers within Winterfell and the Dothraki made their encampment outside the castle walls, Jon and Sansa walked the ramparts. The sky was clear, and the stars glittered like shards of ice. She asked why he had married Daenerys, if it was purely for political reasons. Jon told her the truth, that it began as a possibility for alliance, but had grown into something deeper, that he believed Daenerys had the courage and compassion to rule justly. Sansa asked if he trusted her completely, caution in her voice born of the betrayal she had endured at King's Landing. Jon hesitated but said he did, that every day he spent with Daenerys confirmed her sincerity. Sansa studied him with searching eyes, then nodded, though her worry remained. Their conversation ended with the silent understanding that the North would need to see Daenerys' worth before accepting her fully. Still, Sansa was not blind to the advantage of having dragons on their side, especially if the undead threat was as dire as Jon claimed. Over the next weeks, Daenerys strove to earn the loyalty of the North. She dined with the lords, listened to their concerns, complimented their resilience in the face of the punishing winter. She even ventured into the training yard to watch the warriors practice, her presence drawing both fascination and wariness. Occasionally, she brought her dragons to hunt in the nearby fields, letting the Northerners see firsthand the fearsome creatures. Yet, she was careful not to appear tyrannical. She would not, at Jon's counsel, allow the dragons to torch large expanses of land or threaten the populace. With each passing day, more of the Norse people began to realize that this Targaryen was not a monster, that her actions spoke of genuine concern rather than conquest. A cautious acceptance began to take hold, though some lords still looked upon her with lingering distrust. As winter's grip tightened, news arrived from the south that unsettled everyone. Cersei Lannister had formed alliances with remnants of House Frey and other opportunistic lords. She had also reached out to the Iron Bank of Braavos, securing funds for her armies. Rumors spoke of Euron Greyjoy's fleet prowling the seas, ready to strike. The prospect of fighting a war on two fronts, one against Cersei and her allies, another against the undead, hung over the realm like a gathering storm. Daenerys called a council in Winterfell's hall, inviting the northern lords, Tyrion, Varys, and Sir Davos. There, they debated whether to march south and defeat Cersei before turning north to face the White Walkers, or to hold fast in the north, preparing for the invasion of the dead first. Opinions clashed, voices rose. Sansa argued that the dead could not be reasoned with, that if the Night King was as close as Jon feared, focusing on Cersei now could doom the living. Tyrion countered that if they ignored Cersei, she would strengthen her position and possibly strike at them from behind at the worst possible moment. The debate raged until Daenerys spoke up, her voice calm but resolute. She declared that the greater threat to all life was the Night King. She would not abandon the people of the North to face the undead alone, for that battle was truly the realm's only battle. Cersei could wait. If Cersei decided to attack the North while they were fighting for the survival of humanity, then let the realm see who the true enemy was. There was a silence after Daenerys' words, and in that hush, Jon gave his queen a respectful nod, proud of her for recognizing the priority of the threat. With that decided, they agreed to reinforce the North and call upon any lords or knights with the sense to understand the gravity of the situation. Preparations would be made for an unimaginable war. Despite the looming danger, winter nights in Winterfell offered rare moments of closeness for Daenerys and Jon. In their private chambers warmed by braziers and furs, they would speak of their separate childhoods. He in the halls of Winterfell, always feeling like an outsider. She across the sea, drifting from city to city, dreaming of the home she had never seen. They marveled at the strangeness of fate that had brought them together, forging a bond stronger than any political arrangement they had known. Jon would trace the silver-gold braids of Daenerys' hair, while she rested her head on his shoulder, both comforted and burdened by the knowledge of what lay ahead. In these fragile hours, they found solace in each other, the hush of the night, a reminder that not all was lost to war and fear. Time pressed on, and the quiet that stretched across the northern countryside was like the hold of breath before a great storm. Scouts returned with horrifying reports of the Night King's army advancing. Towns and villages that had once been lively were found deserted, the inhabitants taken or killed. Even the wildlings who had settled within the North's borders felt the icy dread creeping ever closer. Then came the day when word reached Winterfell that the wall had fallen in part. Eastwatch by the sea had been overwhelmed by the army of the dead. The shock reverberated through the castle. There would be no more illusions of safety, no more question that the threat was real. The White Walkers were coming, and they would march south until nothing remained alive. There was no time to gather every soldier from the distant corners of the realm, no time to broker new alliances with houses that still wavered. Daenerys sent ravens to all corners, urging them to ride north if they valued their lives. The lords of Winterfell, the knights from the Vale, and even some bannermen from the Riverlands who believed the warnings assembled at Winterfell's gates. Daenerys mobilized her Unsullied, forming them up outside the castle in the bitter cold, their discipline unyielding. The Dothraki, normally so proud and fierce under the open sky, found themselves unsettled by the endless expanse of snow, but they readied their axe nonetheless, drawn to the prospect of glorious battle. Jon rallied the North, calling on every able-bodied man and woman to take up arms. Sansa oversaw logistical preparations, ensuring that storehouses were full and that refugees had a place to shelter. Arya slipped in and out of the castle like a phantom, gathering intelligence and quietly preparing for the war in her own way. When the Night King's vanguard finally came into view, the sky was overcast, a dull gray that leached color from the world. Distant shapes, skeletal trees, and the slow crawl of ice crystallized the air. Men shivered at the first sight of the undead. Thousands of wights, some clad in tattered rags, others bearing rusted weapons. They advanced in eerie silence, their eyes pale with the glow of an unnatural animus. Among them stalked the White Walkers, tall and gaunt, swords of ice in their hands. Overhead, the swirling clouds occasionally parted, giving glimpses of Daenerys' dragons. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion soared, their roars echoing across the frozen plains. The living arrayed themselves behind barricades, sharpened stakes, and flaming trenches that stretched in front of Winterfell's walls. Atop the battlements, archers stood ready. The North was as prepared as it could be, but no one felt confident. Only the knowledge that any retreat meant certain death drove them to stand firm. Daenerys and Jon moved among their troops, offering words of encouragement. Her presence, mounted on Drogon, was a symbol of fierce hope. Jon stood with Ghost at his side, leading a contingent of northern soldiers and free folk. The tension in the air was thick, and for a brief moment, all the whispered doubts about Targaryens and the rightful king in the north melted away. There was only the living against the dead. When the first clash came, it was like a thunderbolt of horror. The undead surged forward, crashing against the defenses with no regard for their own destruction. The flaming trenches lit the night with flickering, hellish light. Screams tore through the air. Steel clashed against ice, and dragons roared overhead. Daenerys guided Drogon in swift dives, unleashing torrents of dragon fire upon the whites, incinerating whole ranks at once. The heat was immense, melting snow in great patches, turning some of the fields to steaming mud. Yet still the undead came, relentless and ever driven by the Night King's will. Jon led charges on the ground, long claws slashing through white after white. Occasionally a White Walker would engage him, its ice sword colliding with Valyrian steel in a shower of sparks. Each duel was a deadly dance, and more than once, Jon's life was saved by a timely intervention from another fighter. As the night wore on, the lines of the living began to buckle. The undead were too numerous, pressing from all sides. Parts of the castle walls were overrun. The defenders fell back, rallying around the courtyard. Sansa oversaw the evacuation of non-combatants deeper into the crypts, though all knew even that might not be safe if the lines collapsed. The dragons continued to rain fire, but the swirling winds and the unnatural cold radiating from the White Walkers made it difficult to coordinate. Daenerys circled above, scanning for the telltale figure of the Night King. Then she saw him, mounted on an undead dragon of his own. The once-living Viserion, now twisted into a wraith-like creature spewing frost and blue flame. The sight wrenched Daenerys' heart, fueling her fury. She urged Drogon forward, and Rhaegal joined her in a colossal aerial clash. Ice and fire met in the clouds. Viserion's frost breath clashed with Drogon's dragonfire, sending shockwaves of steam across the battlefield. The Night King, with an expression of calm malevolence, hurled spears of ice at the living dragons. One narrowly missed Rhaegal, and Daenerys felt the adrenaline surge of near disaster. On the ground, Jon could only watch as the titanic silhouettes of the dragons battled overhead, a swirling tempest of power and death. In a desperate move, Daenerys had Drogon angled towards the Night King, intending to drench him in dragonfire once and for all. Drogon let loose a torrent of flame that lit the sky like a second dawn. The roar was deafening, and for a moment, Daenerys believed it would be over. But when the fire cleared, she saw the Night King still astride his undead dragon, entirely unharmed. Terror gripped her heart. She remembered Jon's words, that dragonfire might not kill the Night King. In that instant, the Night King hurled a spear of ice with supernatural speed. It struck Drogon's flank, penetrating scales. The mighty beast roared in agony, buckling mid-air. Daenerys clung to his spines, her muscles burning with the effort to remain mounted. Blood dark against the night sky poured from Drogon's wound. A cold wind howled, and Daenerys felt her world lurch as Drogon struggled to remain airborne. On the ground, Jon saw Drogon falter. Without hesitation, he rallied a group of fighters, Grey Worm among them, to push through the undead lines. They carved a path of blood and ice, driven by desperation to reach the area beneath Daenerys and Drogon's descent. Jon glimpsed Daenerys slipping from the dragon's back. Drogon landed hard, crushing scores of wights beneath him, but also collapsing into the courtyard. Flames curled from his mouth, as though he were trying to incinerate everything nearby in a final act of vengeance. Daenerys tumbled free, gasping, her armor stained with blood. Immediately, wights converged on her. But Jon forced his way through, Longclaw slashing. Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed a defensive ring. The wights piled in, a wave of death that threatened to overwhelm them. Daenerys scrambled to her feet, seizing a fallen sword to defend herself. She had learned to fight, though never like this. Flames danced around them, and the stench of death filled the air. They fought back to back, Jon and Daenerys, their wedding vows echoing in their minds, promises to stand beside each other against every foe. Their breath came ragged, sweat and blood mingling, but they did not yield. One by one, the defenders in that courtyard fell, until only a handful remained around them. Above, Rhaegal still battled the undead Viserion, and the clash of dragons lit the sky with horrifying beauty. Then, like the calm eye of a storm, a silence seemed to sweep across the courtyard. The wights parted, and the Night King himself stepped forth, gliding forward with cold arrogance. His eyes, pale and ancient, settled on Jon and Daenerys. A chill ran through the air. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw, every nerve screaming that this was the moment of truth. Daenerys stood beside him, her sword trembling in her hand. The Night King's presence was a void, an absence of life that threatened to swallow everything. He raised his arm. In an instant, fresh corpses strewn across the courtyard began to jerk and rise, their eyes glowing with unholy light. Those who had fallen in defense of Winterfell now turned against their comrades. The circle around Jon and Daenerys constricted. Ghost snarled at the risen dead, but was forced to retreat. It seemed the end was near. Despair threatened to crush Daenerys' heart. She thought of the broken promise of a better world, of her vow to break the wheel, of all those who had placed their hopes in her. She glanced at Jon, seeing the same resignation in his eyes, and yet she also saw a fierce determination that refused to surrender. Time slowed, The Night King strode closer, lifting his ice spear for a killing blow. Jon roared a challenge, rushing forward. Their weapons met in a clash of ice and steel. Sparks flew, the sound a high-pitched shriek. Daenerys tried to intervene, but whites swarmed her, forcing her back. It was then that a blur of movement darted behind the Night King, Arya Stark, leaping from the shadows. In her hand was the Valyrian steel dagger that once belonged to Littlefinger. She aimed for the Night King's exposed back, hoping to end him in a single stroke. But with preternatural speed he whirled, deflecting her attack. Arya pivoted, dropping the dagger from one hand to the other. But before she could strike, the Night King's grip caught her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. Jon bellowed, slashing at the Night King's side, but was again parried. The whites pressed in, preventing him from closing. Time stretched, the tension ripping at the very fabric of hope. Daenerys saw it all in an instant. Arya struggling, Jon pinned down, the Night King preparing to snap Arya's neck. She felt a primal roar build in her chest, an echo of the dragon's ancient fury. With a desperate swing, she carved through the whites in front of her. She had no illusions that her steel alone could kill the Night King. But she saw a glint of black glass at her feet. Dragon glass, shattered from a crate or a fallen soldier's weapon. Without thinking, she dropped her sword and seized a chunk of dragon glass. She plunged it toward the Night King's back, straining to reach him as the whites clawed at her arms. For one dreadful moment, she believed she would never make contact, that it was already too late. But the Night King's attention was on Arya and Jon, and that sliver of an opening proved enough. The shard of dragonglass sank into the Night King's back. A shriek, high and otherworldly, reverberated through the courtyard. The force of the Night King's sudden movement flung Daenerys aside. She hit the ground hard, rolling in the snow. The whites faltered, convulsing momentarily. Jon struck again with Longclaw, the blade biting into the Night King's chest. A flash of icy fractals spread across the inhuman visage, and in the blink of an eye, the Night King shattered into crystalline shards. A shockwave pulsed outward, causing every white to collapse into dust and bone. The entire battlefield fell silent, as though the world held its breath. The undead dragon, Viserion, crumbled in mid-air, and Rhaegal let out a triumphant roar, though wounded and battered. The living stood in stunned disbelief. The courtyard was littered with broken bodies, the stench of blood and burnt flesh choking the air. The great hall's gates were splintered, the walls cracked. But the threat of the dead was ended. It was over. Slowly, a ragged cheer rose from the survivors, though it was laced with the sorrow of immense loss. Jon rushed to Arya, who stumbled free from the white's grip just as the Night King had been destroyed. She coughed and sank to her knees, trembling from the nearness of death. Jon helped her stand. Together, they turned to see Daenerys lying in the snow, dazed from the impact. Jon crossed the courtyard in swift strides, kneeling beside her, gently lifting her onto his lap. She opened her eyes, wincing, and he cradled her face, relief shining in his eyes. They exchanged no words at first, only the silent realization that they had survived the impossible. In the days that followed, the North began the arduous task of recovering from the greatest battle of their age. The wounded were tended, the dead were honored and burned, to prevent any chance of reanimation. The great courtyard was cleared of debris. Daenerys knelt among the survivors, helping where she could. Her dragons, wounded but alive, perched on the battlements, resting after their deadly aerial struggle. The halls of Winterfell were filled with the groans of the injured and the hushed gratitude of those who realized they owed their lives to the alliance that had brought the Targaryen queen and the king in the north together. A funeral pyre was constructed for the fallen, which included countless soldiers from both Daenerys' forces and the North's defenders. Among them were many dear faces. Grey Worm mourned the deaths of many unsullied he had called brothers. The Dothraki wailed in lament for their fallen riders, and the northern lords recited the old prayers for their dead. When the pyre was lit, Daenerys stood with Jon, their hands clasped together. The flames licked at the dark sky, sparks rising into the cold air like tiny souls departing. Tears glittered on Daenerys' cheeks, and Jon's eyes glistened as well. Though their victory had saved Westeros from the darkness beyond the wall, it had come at a heart-wrenching cost. As the last embers faded into the night, a solemn resolve settled on them all. The realm was not yet at peace. Cersei Lannister still occupied the Iron Throne, and no doubt news of the Night King's defeat would reach her. Whether she believed it or not was another matter, but undoubtedly she would realize the living were no longer occupied by the threat from the north. She would expect them to turn south. But now, the North knew Daenerys not just as a foreign invader or Targaryen queen. She was the woman who had fought alongside them, who had nearly died for them. They recognized Jon's wisdom in forging this bond, and in the aftermath of the battle, many lords pledged fealty to Daenerys freely, their doubts burned away by the fires of war. Sansa, who had watched Daenerys risk her life to save Arya, set aside her suspicions and embraced her sister-in-law with genuine gratitude. A unity that had seemed impossible only weeks before now began to blossom in the battered snow of Winterfell. The day came when Daenerys addressed the assembled survivors in the courtyard. Her voice, quiet but carrying an unbreakable conviction, spoke of the war they had won and the war that remained. She spoke of rebuilding the North, of caring for the wounded, and of the need to bring peace to the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. She did not demand oaths of loyalty. Instead, she asked for cooperation. She promised that, together, they would restore the realm so that no kingdom would be left at the mercy of tyrants or external terrors. The murmured responses turned into a rising cheer as the men and women of the North, stark bannermen, free folk, foreigners, saw in Daenerys Targaryen not just a queen but a savior. The snow began to fall softly, as if to grant a gentle benediction to her words. In the privacy of their chambers, Jon and Daenerys looked to the future. Jon still knew nothing of his true parentage. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, had not yet shared that secret. But there was an unspoken sense of fate beginning to unravel. Daenerys wondered if she had finally brought her family's name back to Westeros in a way that would be honored. She did not know if she would sit the Iron Throne, or if she even wanted to seize it by force, but she knew she would not allow Cersei to continue her cruel reign. Jon thought of his promise to the free folk, to the Night's Watch, to all those who looked to him for guidance. He felt torn by loyalties, but every time he looked at Daenerys, a calm certainty settled in him. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Their vow, spoken under foreign skies in Essos, had been tested in the cold crucible of war against the dead. It had survived heartbreak, sacrifice, and fear. And now, with winter's night receding into a cold dawn, a fragile hope was born. A chance that this marriage, this alliance of fire and ice, might not only secure the realm against the living, but also usher in a new era, one where Westeros could finally heal from the wounds of its long and bloody history. Whether that hope would endure the trials to come, the battles in the south, the intrigues of King's Landing, the secrets yet unrevealed, neither Daenerys nor Jon could say. But for now, as they stood on the snowy ramparts of Winterfell, gazing upon a world saved from death's icy grip, they allowed themselves a moment of belief in a tomorrow worth fighting for. They stood on the battlements of Winterfell in the pale morning light, each breath steaming in the frigid air. The pyres had burned through the night, filling the sky with trails of ash and the smell of charred flesh. Survivors shuffled in the courtyard below, huddled beneath cloaks and blankets, taking stock of who was gone and who remained. It was said that the living had triumphed over the dead. But as Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow surveyed the weary faces, they could not help but feel the weight of the price that had been paid. Daenerys' hand rested lightly on Jon's arm, a gesture of quiet solidarity. Around them, the gray stones of Winterfell seemed painted with the memory of battle. Deep scorch marks from dragonfire, clawed gouges in the wall where undead hands had scrabbled for purchase, entire sections of ramparts chipped away by ice spears. A hush had settled over the castle that morning, broken only by the low murmurs of men and women performing the grim tasks of burying or burning the dead. Even the sounds of the dragons were subdued, Drogon's roar reduced to a wounded rumble in the distance as he recovered from the Night King's spear. Rhaegal perched on a broken tower, drooping his wounded wing, while Ghost paced below, nose pressed to the ground in search of familiar scents now gone. Winterfell had always been a place of resilience, shaped by centuries of harsh winters and stoic hearts. Yet the devastation wrought by the White Walkers weighed heavily on everyone. Sansa Stark stood at the edge of the courtyard, her hair braided back in a practical style, eyes rimmed with red from exhaustion and sorrow. Arya moved silently through the corridors, checking on the wounded, occasionally slipping away to gather her thoughts in solitude. Bran, the three-eyed raven, spent long hours by the heart tree in the Godswood, as though listening to whispers in the wind. He said little, his gaze at once distant and infinitely knowing. Daenerys tried to draw warmth from Jon's presence, and he from hers. They had saved the realm from a threat older than any living memory, but the realm was not at peace. A new war loomed to the south, where Cersei Lannister still wore the crown, holding King's Landing in an iron grip. The realms of men had barely survived the onslaught of the dead, and yet the living would soon have to contend with one another. Daenerys reminded herself that for all her talk of breaking the wheel, she had not come so far just to stand back and let Cersei's cruelties go unchallenged. Jon, still caught between his devotion to the North and his loyalty to his queen, knew that the path forward would demand another battle, perhaps many more. But after facing the end of all life, how could they shrink from the lesser evil of one corrupt ruler? They descended the stairs from the battlements together, exchanging a few curt words with grim-faced soldiers, who bowed or bent the knee in respect. The courtyard, once bustling with knights and bannermen preparing for battle, was now a place of aftermath. Wagons loaded with bodies, healers tending the wounded, small folk gathering melted snow to quench their thirst in a land where wells had frozen solid. Daenerys and Jon paused by the remnants of the funeral pyres. The coals still glowed faintly, crackling with the last of the heat. Jon closed his eyes briefly, recalling the friends and allies who had perished. Daenerys felt a wash of grief for the Unsullied, the Dothraki, the Northerners she had come to admire. She remembered faces, men who had followed her across the sea, loyal to the vision of a queen who promised freedom. A cluster of northern lords stood near the broken gate. Lyanna Mormont's body had been found at dawn, having died a hero's death, slaying a white giant that threatened to breach the courtyard. Jorah Mormont, too, had fallen. Daenerys had wept at his side as he breathed his last, his once strong hand clutching hers. These tragedies weighed on them all. If any of the lords still harbored doubts about Daenerys Targaryen, many had been buried in the snow alongside the corpses of the undead. She had fought beside them. She had nearly died beside them. And that counted for more than any rumor. Even so, the sense of caution remained. Northerners had long memories, and loyalties could be as unyielding as the frost. Sansa approached, her posture poised but tired. "A council has been assembled in the Great Hall," she said, her voice steady. "We'll discuss our next steps: food, supplies, how to rebuild, and what to do about the Queen in the south." Her gaze flicked between Jon and Daenerys. "Will you join us?" Jon nodded. "Aye. Let's go." Daenerys gave a small dip of her head, feeling in Sansa's demeanor not quite warmth, but no longer pure hostility. There was a fragile respect there. They walked together, Sansa leading, weaving past the remnants of battle. Once inside Winterfell, the corridors grew close and shadowed, lit by torches that cast flickering shapes on the stone walls. Whispers trailed after them. The great hall doors stood open, revealing the rough lines of benches and tables, many of them scorched or broken. At the high table, a small cluster of figures waited. Tyrion, Varys, Ser Davos, Brienne, Podrick, and a few other key lords like Lord Glover and Lord Royce. Bran had been wheeled in by a servant, sitting quietly off to the side, his eyes half-lidded as though lost in a vision. Daenerys and Jon took their seats. The hush in the chamber was thick. Flames crackled in the hearth, casting an orange glow on tired, hungry faces. A great emptiness hung in the hall, where once men had gathered in full force. Sansa took up a position near the table, crossing her arms as she regarded the others. Davos cleared his throat. "We've lost many good men and women. The walls have been compromised. Supplies are low, though it's no wonder after a siege like that. We'll need to resupply before we can think of moving anywhere." Tyrion inclined his head. "Resupply from where?" "The stores in the north are nearly exhausted from the winter, and the battle has only worsened that. We might need to send word south, attempt to purchase grain or other staples. If we plan to confront Cersei in any capacity, we'll need to do so from a position of strength, not starvation." "Now." Lord Glover shook his head with a grimace. "I doubt you'll find many merchants eager to send shipments north in the dead of winter, and that's if the southern lords don't just refuse to help outright." Sansa's expression tightened. "They may well refuse. Cersei will make promises of gold or reward. She'll use fear against us. And men who haven't seen the dead will cling to comfortable lies. But we should try anyway." "Then Joan's voice was low, filled with the gravity of what he'd witnessed. "We no longer face an army of the dead. That was the threat that forced us all to band together. Now that it's gone, you can be certain that old grudges and ambitions will resurface. Even among our ranks, some might question our alliance with Daenerys." He glanced around, seeing a few nods, a few tight-lipped frowns. "But what alternative do we have? Peace with Cersei." He gave a mirthless laugh. "She sent no help against the White Walkers, broke every vow she made to us. She'll seek to destroy us now that we are weakened." Daenerys felt eyes turn toward her. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself that she was not the frightened girl fleeing assassins across the sea anymore. "We cannot allow Cersei Lannister to remain on the Iron Throne. She has proven she'll betray every principle of decency. If we let her rule unopposed, we concede the realm to tyranny. I have no intention of seeing the Seven Kingdoms descend once more into chaos and oppression when we've just fought so hard to save the living." "Then," Tyrion folded his hands, "we'll need allies. Perhaps some still remain among the Reach Lords or in Dorne. The Ironborn might come to our side. Yara Greyjoy was supportive of your claim, Your Grace. But Euron remains an unpredictable threat on the seas, and if the Golden Company is still at Cersei's disposal, that complicates any southern advance." Sansa spoke. "Then we gather who we can, fortify our position, and march south. The question is when." Bran's distant voice cut through the murmurs. "You must also consider the cost of further war. Many thousands have already died." Heads turned toward him. Bran's eyes seemed focused on something beyond the walls of the great hall. Blood begets blood. Daenerys felt a pang, recalling Meereen, Astapor, and the countless battles she had waged. She had always wanted to be more than just another conqueror. And yet she could not close her eyes to the truth. As long as Cersei sat the throne, more suffering would follow. "I do not wish for more slaughter," she said, her voice measured. "But I'll not leave the Seven Kingdoms at the mercy of a tyrant. If there's a way to spare the innocent, we must find it. But we must act." Varys spoke softly, his expression as unreadable as ever. "War is the last recourse when diplomacy fails. It has often failed with Cersei. Yet we should try again, if only to show the realm who truly seeks peace. Perhaps a raven first. An offer of parley. Let her refuse it, and the lords will see her true colors." Sir Davos nodded at that. "Show her the chance for peace, watch her spit on it. Then we do what we must." Joan's jaw tensed. "We'll need time to recover regardless. Even if we wanted to ride south tomorrow, it would be folly. Our men are exhausted. The dragons are wounded. Winterfell needs repairs." Daenerys looked at Tyrion. "Write the letter. Send the ravens. Invite her to discuss terms. But be prepared for her to refuse." She paused, noting the flicker in Tyrion's eye. "We can't stay idle for too long. Once we've regained enough strength, we'll make our intentions known. The realm must see that we do this, not for personal gain, but for the good of all." With the strategy tentatively agreed upon, the council turned to pressing practicalities. Sansa and the northern lords listed the supplies needed: timber, stone, grain, medicinal herbs. Sir Davos volunteered to coordinate with the Vale to see if Lady Arryn might assist. Tyrion mentioned reaching out to the Tyrell bannermen, though House Tyrell was no more, and the Reach had effectively been under the rule of House Tarly until Randall Tarly's death. Meanwhile, Daenerys proposed sending a small retinue back to Dragonstone to oversee shipments that might arrive there. The painted table at Dragonstone could also serve once again as a strategic center. As the meeting wound down, the tension in the hall eased slightly. Even small agreements felt like relief after such horror and confusion. People began to filter out, each tasked with responsibilities. Jon rose, turning to Daenerys. "I'll speak with Tormund and the Free Folk. They might assist with gathering supplies from the more remote northern territories. They're used to harsh conditions." "Uneasy." Daenerys nodded. "Thank you. I'll check on the dragons with Grey Worm. Drogon's wound needs attention, and Rhaegal as well." They parted with a soft exchange of glances. The castle corridors felt different now, the once lurking sense of doom replaced by a solemn determination to rebuild. Outside, the sky was still that pale winter gray, though the snowfall had tapered off. Daenerys pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as she made her way toward the area where Drogon had taken refuge after the battle. The dragon had collapsed in a courtyard near the old kennels, ringed by Unsullied who guarded him warily. His scales bore the ugly scar of the Night King's ice spear, and some of the black plating was chipped or shredded. Daenerys approached slowly, speaking gentle words in Valyrian. Drogon lifted his massive head, exhaling a gust of warm air that ruffled her hair. She moved closer, laying a hand on his flank. Beneath her palm, she felt the rumble of pain that coursed through him. Grey Worm stood nearby, his face as impassive as ever, though Daenerys could see lines of exhaustion marking his brow. "My queen?" he said, bowing slightly. "We have salves from your healers. They say they will help prevent infection." "Thank you, Grey Worm," she replied. "Your men fought bravely. You all did." Her voice tightened. "I'm sorry for those we lost." Grey Worm inclined his head. "They died free, defending a cause they believed in. That is more than many in Essos ever had." He hesitated. "The Unsullied will follow you south, Your Grace. We will finish this war and ensure the safety you promised." "Benai." She gave him a sad smile. "I only wish it did not have to come to more bloodshed." Her gaze shifted to Drogon's wound, and she called for one of the healers to approach. The woman, breath pluming in the cold, showed Daenerys how to apply a thick salve that smelled of bitter herbs. Drogon growled, but allowed his mother's touch. "Stay strong, my child," Daenerys murmured. "We have more battles ahead, but we will not face them unprepared." As she worked, her mind flickered with memories of what had nearly happened. Her near fall from Drogon's back, the Night King's spear glinting in the moonlight, Jon wading through a sea of whites to reach her side. She felt again the terror and the fierce relief. The promise she and Jon had made to each other, to stand against any storm, burned bright in her heart. The warmth of that thought carried her through the day's grim tasks. A few courtyards over, Jon inspected the battered sections of wall with Tormund, the tall wildling chieftain who still bore healing scratches from the fight. They exchanged brusque words about repairs, about the free folk who remained outside the castle walls in makeshift camps. Winterfell had barely been large enough to house all its defenders, and now it was overflowing with the wounded and displaced. Jon promised Tormund that, once the roads were clear, some of the free folk could return north to the territories they preferred, while others might find a place in the north settlements. But Tormund only shrugged, smiling his broad, toothy grin. "You have your queen, Crow," he said. "And now you have a realm to look after. You sure you're not regretting it?" Jon gave a half smile. "There's too much at stake for regret. She's proven herself here, Tormund." That she has," Tormund said. "But the South is full of liars and schemers. Your Dragon Queen might find that out the hard way." Jon's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sky merged with pale snow. "So might I." He clapped Tormund on the shoulder. "Look after your people. When the time comes to march, I'll be calling on you." Tormund nodded. "We'll be ready, but if any of my folk prefer the lands beyond the wall, I'll lead them there once we're sure no dead remain." Jon agreed and moved on, checking barricades and greeting the men who rebuilt them. Over the coming days, ravens flew from Winterfell in all directions, to the Vale, to the Riverlands, to Dragonstone, to Dorne, and even to King's Landing. Daenerys' proposed letter, edited by Tyrion's practiced hand, invited Cersei to a parley, and warned that further bloodshed would serve no one. Meanwhile, Tyrion counseled that a second letter might go to any lords still wavering in their loyalty, and appealed that the war with the dead had proven Daenerys' commitment to the realm. Word of mouth would spread tales of the Night King's defeat and the dragon's valor, and Tyrion hoped such stories would shift allegiances. Much to no one's surprise, days later a raven returned from King's Landing with a perfunctory reply. Cersei refused to come north. If they wanted a parley, they could enter the city gates under a banner of truce, on her terms. Even reading the words was enough to make Tyrion curse under his breath. He relayed the message to Daenerys in a tight-lipped manner, concluding that it was likely a trap or a ruse to buy time. But Daenerys only smiled thinly. "So be it," she said. "We gave her the chance to negotiate. If she wants us to walk into a den of vipers, I see no reason to humor her." Tyrion rapped his knuckles on the table. "We should still consider sending a delegation. Sometimes even the pretense of peace can be used to sow doubt among her allies. It might fracture her support." Yen? Jon, who stood by the hearth in Winterfell's map room, glanced at Daenerys. "It's a risk, one I'm not sure is worth taking. We can't afford to lose you or Tyrion to one of her traps." Daenerys tilted her chin up, silver blonde hair catching the firelight. "I will not go myself. That would be too great a danger, especially with dragons still in need of healing. But Tyrion is right that we must show the realm who truly seeks peace." She turned to Tyrion. "If you think a small delegation can accomplish that, I'll leave it to your judgment. But I'm sure you have a plan for escape if things go poorly." Tyrion inclined his head. "I always try to have a plan, Your Grace, and a spare plan for when the first fails." He traced a route on the map with his finger. "I'll need a discreet escort, though. A large army would spook Cersei or give her reason to attack." Jon stepped forward. "I'll send men I trust. The fewer, the better. Sir Davos is a good choice if he's willing. He has a gift for diplomacy." Davos, standing in a corner, sighed. "Hey, I have a gift for avoiding getting my head chopped off, you mean? But I'll do it if I must." He rubbed his stubbled jaw. "Wouldn't mind seeing King's Landing again, though it's hardly a place of happy memories." Daenerys placed her hand on the table, glancing at each of them in turn. "We'll attempt this parley, but we'll not delay our own preparations. The day we can march south with a force strong enough to challenge Cersei is coming. We'll use the time to repair Winterfell, to gather allies, to train soldiers. Once we're ready, we'll see what the rest of the realm has decided." That was the plan. Over the next fortnight, the battered north roused itself from despair, forging and mending what was broken. Makeshift repairs filled the holes in Winterfell's walls, the gates were reinforced, and the battered courtyard was cleared of the last remnants of the undead. Forges roared with new blacksmiths at work, shaping swords and spear tips. The free folk scoured the countryside for game, bringing back what food they could. Sansa organized a system of rationing to ensure no one starved. It was a time of slow, painstaking effort, but each day a bit of color returned to men's cheeks, and morale rose. Daenerys kept a presence among the people, walking through the courtyard to speak with soldiers, hearing their stories. Some days she ventured out with Jon to see the small farms around Winterfell, checking on families who had huddled in barns during the onslaught. She found the North's stoicism admirable, though it pained her to see how even children had grown accustomed to hardship. Often she'd notice how these Northmen looked upon her with curiosity, this foreign queen with dragons who had fought to save them. Some approached, shyly, offering thanks. Others kept their distance, still unsure. Jon, guiding her on these rounds, felt a quiet pride that Daenerys was willing to step into the muddy fields and soot-stained huts to better understand the people she hoped to rule. The nights were a different matter. In the stillness of the castle's chambers, Daenerys and Jon shared rare moments of closeness. Sometimes they would stand by a small window in the library tower, gazing at the moonlight on the snow, talking in hushed tones about the future. Daenerys confessed her lingering fears that she was destined to be seen as just another conqueror, that all her talk of liberating the realm might be overshadowed by the reality of war. Jon, in turn, spoke of how he had never truly felt like he belonged anywhere until now, with her. They found solace in each other's arms, even as the shadows of what lay ahead loomed large. At last, Tyrion and Sir Davos departed for King's Landing with a few trusted guards, braving the King's Road in Winterfell. It was a small caravan, bundled against the cold, carrying a banner of truce. Days stretched into weeks as Winterfell awaited news of their arrival. In the meantime, ravens trickled in from various corners of the realm. Some houses pledged quiet support to Daenerys, impressed by the victory in the north or embittered by Cersei's broken promises. Others remained silent or sent non-committal replies. From Dorne came only a vague response that they were considering their future, ever a land apart. From the Iron Islands, Yara's Raven confirmed she still held the islands and was ready to support Daenerys as soon as the seas were free of Euron's menace. In those interim weeks, a hush seemed to settle over the land. The armies licked their wounds. The small folk tried to harvest what they could before the deep freeze of winter truly set in. Daenerys oversaw the healing of Drogon's wounds, ensuring the salves were applied regularly. She could see he was regaining strength, and Rhaegal likewise, though both dragons' roars lacked the same unbridled power they once held. The death of Viserion, twisted into an undead creature only to crumble at the Night King's demise, left a persistent ache in Daenerys' heart. She often recalled the day she'd named the hatchlings, after men she'd loved and lost, never imagining that one would meet such a grim fate. Then came the day when a raven arrived from Tyrion. The parchment's words were terse. They had made it to King's Landing. Cersei had greeted them with minimal courtesy, allowing them entrance under heavy guard. A parley had been granted in the Red Keep, overshadowed by the menace of the Mountain, who loomed behind Cersei's throne like a silent executioner. The Queen had listened to Tyrion's words about peace with a mocking smile, offering no commitment, except to say she'd consider their demands to stand down. Tyrion warned that it was almost certainly a feint. Cersei was fortifying the city and had the Golden Company at her disposal. She remains dangerous, the letter concluded, and the city is braced for siege. If we are to avoid massive bloodshed, we must find another way. But if there is no other way, be prepared for a long, brutal conflict. Signed simply, Tyrion Lannister. Daenerys read it aloud in Jon's presence, her frustration palpable. "Shall never give up power willingly," Daenerys said, handing the parchment to Jon. "We could starve the city out, but that means countless innocents suffer." Jon nodded, scanning the letter. "A siege might last months, even years. You don't want to be remembered as the queen who starved 500,000 people." "Nashsuar." "No," Daenerys said fiercely. "I do not." She exhaled, her breath a shudder in the cold. "But we may not have many choices if we can't break her defenses. King's Landing is massive. Even with dragons, it would be a bloodbath if we're forced to burn sections of the city. I won't do that. I won't become what my father threatened to be." Jon placed a hand on her arm. "We'll find another way. We have to." A troubled silence passed between them. They both remembered the terror of being surrounded by fire and ice, and how close the realm had come to annihilation at the Night King's hands. Another great slaughter felt like a betrayal of all those they had lost. Still, as the weeks wore on, planning for the southern campaign advanced. The north, battered but resolute, prepared to march. A contingent from the Vale answered Sansa's call, led by Lord Royce. They brought precious supplies from the Eyrie: wheat, salted meats, barley. That might sustain the combined armies. Smaller houses in the Riverlands sent a trickle of support, though many were still reeling from the devastation wrought by the Freys and Lannisters in previous wars. Gendry, newly legitimized as a Baratheon by royal decree in the final days of the fight against the dead, arrived at Winterfell with a handful of Stormlanders who agreed to follow him. He found himself somewhat awkward in his role, unsure of how to command men who expected a Baratheon's leadership. But Arya observed him from a distance with a small smile. Amid these preparations, a new tension began to ripple through Winterfell. Bran Stark, who had spent so much time in cryptic silence, asked to speak privately with Samwell Tarly, who had returned north in the aftermath of the battle. They conferred quietly in the Godswood. Over the course of several days, Sam was seen moving about the castle with a troubled expression, occasionally glancing in Jon's direction. Daenerys, noticing the furtive behavior, felt a faint stirring of worry. She'd sensed for some time that Bran saw truths hidden to all others, truths that might reshape loyalties. But Jon had never spoken of any secrets from Bran, nor had Sam. And she herself had glimpsed no sign that either man meant to undermine their cause. She tried to dismiss her suspicions as the usual swirl of rumors that plagued every court. It happened on an evening when the castle was quiet, the day's toils ended. A guard came to Daenerys' chamber, a small antechamber off the king's tower that she shared with Jon. The guard informed her that Bran Stark and Samwell Tarly wished to speak with her and Jon in private. Feeling an odd flutter in her stomach, she told them to come. Jon looked equally puzzled, exchanging a questioning glance with her as they waited. The door opened. Bran was wheeled in by a servant, the soft hush of wheels on stone, and Sam followed with heavy steps. Jon rose from his seat by the small fireplace. "Bran? Sam? Is something wrong?" Bran's gaze was unreadable. Sam licked his lips, as though steeling himself. We have news," Sam said carefully, darting a glance at Daenerys. Daenerys stood, a sense of foreboding gripping her. "What is it?" Bran inhaled slowly, then fixed his dark eyes on Jon. "You asked about your mother once, Jon. About who she was, and about the circumstances of your birth." "They not away." Jon frowned. Yes, I remember. You said you had seen some things, but we had more pressing matters." "The realm was at stake," Bran said, almost gently. "But now, with the dead vanquished and a new war brewing, I believe you should know the truth." He paused, his voice low and resonant. "You are not Ned Stark's bastard son, Jon. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen, son of the Mad King, and your mother was Lyanna Stark, Ned's sister." A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Jon stared at Bran, disbelief warring with a glimmer of recognition. Daenerys felt her entire world tilt as her heart pounded in her ears. Rhaegar Targaryen, that was her brother, long dead. If Bran spoke true, that made Jon. "It's impossible," Jon whispered, though his voice shook. "Ned Stark raised me as his own. He never said anything." "He kept you safe," Bran murmured. "Robert Baratheon would have killed you if the truth were known. Lyanna died in childbirth, and Ned took you, lied to everyone to protect you." Bran's voice was strangely calm, as though he had rehearsed these words in his head 1,000 times. "Your real name is Aegon Targaryen. You are the legitimate son of Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. They were married in secret." The silence thickened like a vice around them all. Sam spoke next, his tone quieter. "I found a record in the Citadel. It confirmed the annulment of Rhaegar's previous marriage and his subsequent remarriage to Lyanna Stark." Bran's visions filled in the rest. "Biden." Jon swayed on his feet, leaning against the stone mantel, as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes flicked to Daenerys, full of sudden horror and confusion. She felt her breath catch in her throat, an invisible hand crushing her lungs. If Rhaegar was Jon's father, then Jon was her nephew, a Targaryen by blood, heir to the throne by the line of succession. Jon was the rightful king, if one followed the laws of inheritance. Their marriage. She realized with a dizzying swirl of emotion that they were aunt and nephew. Blood of the dragon, entwined in ways she had never imagined. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind at once. Targaryen tradition had, at times, allowed close relatives to wed. Aegon the Conqueror himself had married his sisters. But Daenerys, raised partly in the East and shaped by a different era, felt a jolt of dismay and confusion. Had they unknowingly repeated the old Targaryen ways? And what did it mean for their claim to the throne, for their bond, for their love? She saw the reflection of her own shock in Jon's face. Jon found his voice at last. "This can't be." He turned to Sam. "You're sure?" Sam nodded, looking pained. Bran's visions, the records in the Citadel, they aligned perfectly. He cast Daenerys a sympathetic glance. "We would not have brought this to you if we weren't certain. But the realm must know the truth, or at least you must. Bran's voice was quieter than before. I'm sorry, Jon, but you needed to know what you are. Jon ran a hand through his dark hair, breathing hard. He turned to Daenerys, eyes filled with an anguish she could hardly bear to see. I'm Rhaegar's son, he whispered, as though seeking reassurance that it wasn't real. But she could not give him that. Slowly, she stepped forward, arms feeling leaden at her sides. She wanted to reach for him, to comfort him, but her own thoughts whirled in turmoil. That would make you the heir to the Iron Throne, she said, her voice trembling. You, not me. Jon's gaze flicked to Bran, then back to Daenerys. That was never what I wanted. His words came out hoarse. I never asked for any throne. I bent the knee to you, Dany. He swallowed painfully, searching her face. We're married. Gods, what does this mean? She wanted to tell him it changed nothing. She wanted to say it changed everything. The words stuck in her throat. The wave of realization that they were blood kindred crashed against the knowledge that Targaryens had married within their line for centuries. And then there was the small, terrible fear blooming in her heart. The fear that the lords of Westeros would rally around Jon the moment they learned the truth, discarding her as a usurper. Or, perhaps worse, that Jon himself would feel compelled to claim what was rightfully his. She saw none of that ambition in his eyes now, only heartbreak and dismay. But the realm had ways of twisting men's hearts. Could it twist Jon's? Sam, sensing the tension, said quietly, "We'll leave you to speak. We had to bring you this. What you do with the truth is up to you." He bowed his head, and Bran nodded in silent agreement. They exited, leaving Daenerys and Jon alone. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind sighed at the window. Daenerys' thoughts churned. The image of the Dragonstone throne in her mind, the ghosts of her brother Viserys' obsession with kingship, the stories of her father's madness. Jon was the true heir, son of Rhaegar. He had the stronger claim, by all the laws of inheritance. She wondered if that would force them into conflict. She recalled the struggles in Essos, how so many times she'd been forced to defend her birthright, how everything she had done was bound up in the notion that she was the last Targaryen to stand for her family's legacy. Except she wasn't the last. And ironically, her vow to break the wheel had never considered the possibility of another Targaryen, especially one she loved. Finally, Jon broke the silence. "Dany," he said, stepping closer, voice raw. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I never would have." He stopped, as though the rest was too painful to say. She understood what he meant. If he'd known, would he ever have allowed himself to love her as he did? To marry her? Targaryen custom might not forbid it, but the rest of Westeros might see it as an abomination. Or it might see it as tradition. The old ways of the dragon riders were strange and often reviled, but that had never stopped those of pure Valyrian blood from continuing their line. A swirl of half-remembered histories churned in her mind. "I believe you," she said quietly, reaching a trembling hand toward his cheek. "None of us knew. The question is, what do we do now?" He captured her hand in his, pressing it against his cheek. His face was warm, his eyes swimming with emotion. "I don't want the throne," he whispered. "I never have. My father, and Stark, he raised me to serve the realm, not to rule it. The only reason I accepted being king in the north was because my people asked it of me, and because I needed to unite them." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I bent the knee to you, Dany, because I believed in you. That hasn't changed." "None." Her chest tightened. "But you have the stronger claim. All the lords of Westeros, once they know." Jon shook his head. "I won't let them tear us apart. I'm not going to claim anything over you. This changes nothing about what we must do. We fight Cersei. We bring peace. That's our vow." She couldn't contain the flicker of relief that swept through her. Yet it was tinged with doubt. "The realm might force the crown upon you, whether you want it or not. We can't ignore that possibility." He drew her closer, his voice steadier now. "Then let me deny it. If the realm finds out, I will tell them I stand beside you, not above you. We're joined in marriage already. If they accept you, they accept me as consort. Or if they insist, we share the rule, as Aegon shared with his sisters. I don't care about the ceremony, only that we stand together. Nin. She recalled stories of Aegon the Conqueror, who had ruled with Visenya and Rhaenys at his side, forging the 7 kingdoms into one realm by blood and fire. But the thought of her and Jon repeating that arrangement, he, the legitimate heir, and she, the queen who had forged her claim through conquest, felt like a heavy mantle. Yet seeing Jon's sincerity, the way he pressed his forehead to hers in earnest, banished some of her fears. I love you, she whispered, and I won't let a crown come between us. Jon's arms wrapped around her, and for a moment they simply breathed, holding each other, struggling to reconcile the revelation that they were bloodkin, that the entire tapestry of their identities had shifted. The quiet crackle of flames in the hearth and the distant, howling wind underscored the fragility of the moment. He spoke against her hair, voice hushed. If this secret can remain between us, maybe we can keep it that way. Only Bran, Sam, and we two would know. She drew back slightly, gazing into his eyes. Bran can see the past. Sam has read the records. They told us because they felt it was right. If we asked them to keep it hidden, will they? Jon hesitated. Bran may not be inclined to spread it. Sam, I think, would follow my wishes if he understands the greater good. We could keep it quiet, avoid dividing our allies. Daenerys considered it. Was it right to hide the truth from those who followed them? Yet the risk of revealing it now, on the eve of war with Cersei, might fracture their fragile alliance. The North might rally even more strongly around Jon, casting Daenerys as an outsider. Southerners who feared Targaryens might see him as the more acceptable alternative. We would be asking them to lie. Jon's jaw clenched. We'd be asking them to protect the realm from further conflict. Isn't that what they want too? Peace instead of more bloodshed over succession? And she nodded slowly. Yes, we should speak to Bran and Sam then. Ask them to keep this to themselves until the war with Cersei is done. After that, she trailed off, uncertain. We'll decide what to tell the realm. Perhaps the realm will be so grateful for peace that it won't matter which Targaryen sits the throne. The corners of her mouth lifted in a faint, wry smile. We could rule together if that's what it takes. Jon's relief was almost palpable. He leaned in, pressing his lips to her forehead. They remained that way for a moment, absorbing the warmth of each other in an otherwise cold, uncertain world. For now, they had a plan. Keep this secret until the realm was safe. Neither said aloud the truth that continued to hover in the space between them, that they were aunt and nephew, bound by Targaryen blood in more ways than one. The old Targaryen tradition would say there was no shame in it, yet the rest of Westeros might recoil in horror. But they were not their forebears, and their feelings had taken root long before they knew of their shared lineage. Let the future judge them. For now, love and necessity held them together. They summoned Bran and Sam the following day, in the privacy of the same chamber. The conversation was brief but charged. Jon explained that he wished the truth kept hidden for the sake of unity. Sam looked uneasy, wringing his hands, but eventually agreed that perhaps it was best to wait. Bran, for his part, only nodded calmly. The future, I see, isn't set, he said in his quiet voice. I will speak no unprompted word of this. The next weeks passed in a kind of tense normalcy. Daenerys continued to attend councils, hearing updates on the forging of weapons and the readiness of soldiers. Jon trained with the men in the yard, ensuring their discipline. Winter's grip on the land tightened, cold winds scouring the fields, forcing the armies to gather closer to Winterfell. Tyrion and Davos returned from their foray in King's Landing, bringing little beyond the news that Cersei had no intention of negotiating. Tyrion looked relieved to be out of the city, though he wore a worried frown at the mention of the Golden Company's preparations. Davos only muttered about the stench of the place. Daenerys did not immediately confide in Tyrion or Davos about Jon's parentage, deciding it was safer to keep as few people involved as possible. Even so, Tyrion occasionally gave Jon thoughtful looks, as though sensing something had shifted, but Daenerys attributed it to the natural wariness that followed so many revelations. At last, the day came when scouts confirmed that the roads were somewhat navigable, and that their forces, while not at full strength, were as ready as they could be for the march south. Supplies were stocked in wagons, the wounded who could travel prepared themselves, and those who could not were left in the care of the remaining healers and small folk loyal to House Stark. Sansa made the decision to remain in Winterfell, to oversee its defense and ensure that the North continued to function. Arya, however, chose to ride south with the army, determined to play her part in the end of Cersei Lannister. Bran stayed behind, rarely leaving the Godswood, though his presence felt somehow larger than the confines of the castle. In the pre-dawn gloom, Daenerys stood with Jon near the stables, her breath fogged in the chill air. Rows of men and women, wrapped in cloaks, lined up behind them. The Unsullied stood at attention, more than half their original number lost in the battle against the dead. The Dothraki gathered on their horses, eyes glittering with the fierce desire to avenge their fallen. Northern bannermen and knights from the Vale, along with the smattering of Stormlanders under Gendry's banner, filled out the ranks. It was a motley force, but they had been tested in the crucible of the long night and emerged tempered by fire and ice. Drogon and Rhaegal, their injuries largely healed, took to the skies with a thunder of wings, circling overhead. The wind of their passing stirred Daenerys' hair, sending a shiver of both excitement and trepidation through her. She turned to Jon, who met her gaze with a solemn nod. Their eyes held a myriad unspoken truths, not least of which was the secret of his true lineage. But beyond that lay the vow they shared, to fight for a realm free from tyranny. They rode out as the morning light stained the horizon in pale gold. Winterfell's gates yawned open to receive the long column of soldiers and supply wagons. Sansa stood on the ramparts, watching her brother and her queen depart. She raised one hand in silent farewell. Below, the small folk lined the route, some cheering, some merely watching with guarded hope. The hush of the snow muffled the clatter of hooves and boots, giving their departure a somber kind of grandeur. Days stretched into weeks on the King's Road. They moved slowly, hindered by the cold and the need to keep the supply lines intact. At times, Jon and Daenerys soared ahead on dragonback, scouting the terrain. They flew over frozen rivers and fields, over small villages where peasants looked up in awe at the winged shapes overhead. Occasionally, they landed in a clearing to rest, giving the dragons a chance to hunt. Daenerys found that more villages opened their doors willingly once they saw the black and green dragons overhead, remembering stories of the living's victory against the dead. They offered what hospitality they could: bread, salt, mead. In return, Daenerys and Jon promised justice and better days ahead, if only the realm could unite. Even so, rumors traveled faster than armies. By the time they reached Moat Cailin, the old fortress that once guarded the north, they began to hear tales of Lannister patrols harassing the riverlands. Some said the Golden Company was garrisoned outside King's Landing, drilling day and night. Others whispered that Qyburn, Cersei's macabre hand, had developed new weapons to kill dragons, cunning ballistae more deadly than before. Tyrion took note of every rumor, sorting truth from speculation as best he could. Gendry parted ways for a short time, riding ahead to Storm's End to rally any remaining Stormlords who might heed the call of a Baratheon. The rest of the army pressed on, crossing the Neck and entering the Riverlands, where the temperature, while cold, was more forgiving than the biting freeze of the north. Jon and Daenerys spent many nights in the map tent, studying old campaigns. Sir Davos, Grey Worm, and Arya joined them, planning how best to approach King's Landing without risking a disastrous siege. The plan that gradually emerged was to push south, capturing key strongholds or forging alliances along the way. They would attempt to isolate King's Landing, cut off its supply lines, and offer terms to any lords who were willing to abandon Cersei. All the while, Jon and Daenerys navigated their private reality. In stolen moments, huddled together in a tent warmed by a brazier, or walking along a riverbank while the army camped, they whispered of their fears regarding his parentage. Daenerys reassured him that she would not yield her vow to break the wheel. Jon insisted he had no desire to usurp her. Each time they parted, they carried the weight of a secret that could shatter their unity if revealed at the wrong moment. But their bond remained unbroken, fueled by love, respect, and the shared burden of leadership. As they advanced through the riverlands, some lords came forth to offer fealty. They had seen enough war to know which way the wind was blowing, and the rumor that Daenerys Targaryen rode dragons and had defeated the undead gained her a certain awe. Others, more entrenched in Lannister pockets, skirmished with Daenerys' vanguard, but these pockets of resistance were small. Often, they surrendered once the dragons made a single fiery pass overhead. Daenerys took care not to unleash the full fury of Drogon or Rhaegal on towns or farmland, mindful of the vow she had made to protect the innocent. Instead, she used the dragons more as a warning, a demonstration that her might was not to be challenged lightly. As the army approached the ruins of Harrenhal, once the grandest castle in Westeros, and now a blasted husk from Aegon's conquest, they found it deserted except for a few squatters and outlaws. The massive, melted towers loomed over them, a testament to the Targaryen power that once shaped history. Jon and Daenerys camped by the ancient fortress, walking through the scorched halls as Tyrion recounted how Aegon's dragons had turned Harren's pride into a blackened tomb. Daenerys felt the echo of that legacy in her bones, recalling that she was not the only Targaryen to set foot on these grounds. Yet in those hollow chambers, she resolved anew that she would not be a queen of ash. They left Harrenhal behind, continuing southward. Scouts brought word that Cersei's outlying forces were falling back toward King's Landing, consolidating their strength behind the city walls. A handful of small engagements flared along the roads. A detachment of Lannister soldiers, led by a minor lord, refused to yield. Daenerys Dothraki charged and overwhelmed them in the space of an afternoon. Another group of sellswords from Essos, not the Golden Company but a smaller band, tried to harass the supply lines, only to be chased off by the Northerners. With each confrontation, Daenerys' army grew more confident, though she remained watchful for any cunning trap from Cersei. The memory of the ambush that had nearly killed Drogon with a scorpion bolt was never far from her mind. Spring was still a distant promise in the cold air, when at last they neared King's Landing. The farmland around the capital showed signs of forced conscription. Fields left fallow, barns empty, peasants fleeing. Smoke rose from the horizon, not thick black plumes, but the wispy trails of distant fires. Daenerys and Jon ascended a small hill that overlooked a wide plain, from which the city's massive walls and towers could be glimpsed in the distance. The Red Keep stood on its rocky promontory above the harbor, banners of the crowned lion fluttering red and gold in the wind. Jon exhaled, resting a hand on the hilt of Longclaw. "So it comes to this." Daenerys nodded. "Every step of my life has led me here," she murmured, eyes on the distant city. "But we'll do this with care. I won't slaughter innocents to root out Cersei." "Nielsen?" They rode back to the main encampment, where tents sprawled in neat rows, the armies resting and making final preparations. Tyrion awaited them, along with Sir Davos, Grey Worm, Arya, and a handful of other key advisors. Maps were spread on a large wooden table. Tyrion pointed to the choke points around King's Landing, the Rose Rad to the west, the Gold Road where they stood, the Blackwater River curving around the city's southern flank, and the sea to the east. "Cersei will have the bulk of her troops behind the walls," Tyrion said. "The Golden Company may be stationed outside the gates to counter any quick assault. She'll have scorpions on the battlements, no doubt improved by Qyburn's foul experiments. We can't just fly the dragons in blindly." Sir Davos scratched his beard. "A siege is inevitable. The city can hold out for a while, though not indefinitely. If we cut off supply routes from the Roseruad and the sea, we might starve them out. But that punishes the people more than Cersei." Arya's eyes narrowed. "We need to get inside. A small group could slip through, perhaps at night, or through secret passages." She glanced at Tyrion. "You lived there for years. Are there ways in that Cersei might have forgotten?" Tyrion leaned over the map. "It's possible. The city is riddled with old tunnels and passageways, but Qyburn may have sealed or trapped them. There's also the approach from the Dragon Pit, though that's likely guarded." Jon frowned. "A direct assault on the walls would cost many lives." But waiting too long costs us the faith of the people. Cersei will say we're no better than invaders starving them out. Many. Daenerys folded her arms, studying the layout of King's Landing. She recalled the vision she'd once had in the House of the Undying, a throne room in ruins, ash falling like snow. She shivered involuntarily, pushing that memory aside. We'll blockade the roads. We'll keep the sea under watch with any ships we have. We'll attempt to force Cersei to negotiate terms for surrender. Let's see if we can encourage the people inside the city to rise against her, though that may be difficult. She rules by fear, but fear can be broken if the alternative is hope. Now in Nepal, Tyrion exhaled, nodding. We might spread word that any who flee the city will be allowed safe passage, no matter their status. If the small folk believe they can escape without being slaughtered by your army, they might pressure Cersei from within. At least we could spare innocents from the fighting. Jon agreed. Yes. Let's give them every chance. If Cersei tries to prevent them from leaving, that will prove to the realm she's holding them hostage. The plan was set in motion. Over the following days, Daenerys' forces positioned themselves around King's Landing, not too close to the scorpion-laden walls, but near enough to prevent large-scale supply trains from entering. Yara Greyjoy's ships finally arrived from the Iron Islands, blockading the Blackwater Bay from any fleets loyal to Cersei. At Daenerys' command, riders circled the city with banners proclaiming that all innocents would be granted safe passage if they wished to leave. Word spread among the peasants inside the gates, many of whom were starving or terrified of the coming battle. But Cersei's soldiers patrolled the walls, menacing anyone who drew too close to the city exits. Despite these challenges, some families did manage to slip out, bribing guards or finding hidden ways. Daenerys' army took them in, giving them what food they could spare. Tyrion questioned many, hoping to glean the mood of the city. They reported that Cersei had indeed placed scorpions on the walls and on ships in the harbor. The Golden Company was stationed at the main gates, well-armed and well-trained. Morale among the common folk was low, but they feared Cersei's wrath if they attempted open revolt. The tension thickened in the air with each passing hour, like the silent crackle before a thunderstorm. One afternoon, as Daenerys flew overhead on Drogon, assessing the city's defenses from a high vantage point, she spotted what looked like a single rider approaching the camp from the northern road, bearing a banner of House Lannister. Intrigued, she guided Drogon down and summoned Jon, Tyrion, and the others. The rider, upon reaching the perimeter of Daenerys' forces, raised empty hands to show no weapons. He was escorted into camp. Removing his helm revealed a dusty, middle-aged knight with haggard eyes. He bowed stiffly. "My name is Sir Loren Rosby, sworn to House Lannister. I bear a message from Queen Cersei." He produced a sealed letter, which Tyrion took and broke open. Tyrion read it, his mouth tightening. Then he handed it to Daenerys. She scanned the contents. Cersei demanded that Daenerys and her traitorous northern consort surrender immediately, disband their armies, and hand over the dragons to be destroyed. In return, Cersei would spare the lives of their soldiers, though the terms for Jon and Daenerys themselves were ominously absent. The letter ended with a warning. "If you do not comply, my new weapons will annihilate your beasts, and I will feed your corpses to the crows." Daenerys felt cold fury rise within her. She lowered the parchment and addressed Sir Loren. "Tell your queen we will not surrender to tyranny. If she values her people, she should surrender herself or come to negotiate a truce that spares the innocent." Nay. Sir Loren swallowed, glancing at the black-scaled dragon behind Daenerys. "She does not intend to come to terms, Your Grace. She believes the city can withstand any siege." Tyrion narrowed his eyes. "She forgets that we have dragons. She underestimates them at her peril." Sir Loren gave a slight shrug, as though he knew better than to argue with a Targaryen and a Lannister who had turned against his queen. "I only bear her words. Let me return now, if you will, or kill me, if you must." Daenerys studied him. He was but a messenger, caught in the crossfire of forces greater than he. "You may return," she said quietly, "but carry my warning back to your queen. I will not burn King's Landing to ashes unless she forces me to it. However, My patience is not infinite. She may not care for the lives of her subjects, but I do. If she pushes me to the brink, the blood is on her hands." He bowed and rode away, disappearing down the road that led to the city's gates. Daenerys, Jon, Tyrion, and the others remained at the camp, the sense of inevitability thick in the air. They had done what they could to avoid a massacre, blockading, offering safe passage, calling for negotiations. But it seemed certain that Cersei would force them into open conflict. Each day, more of the city's inhabitants fled, scurrying out through bribed guards or hidden passages, while Cersei's men cracked down, turning the city into a powder keg of fear and resentment. A crescendo loomed. Daenerys felt it in the tightening of her chest whenever she looked upon the Red Keep's distant spires. She would recall the House of the Undying Vision, the snow or ash drifting through the ruined throne room. She refused to let that vision become reality, refused to see the city burned. But she knew that even a careful assault might unleash havoc. She found some solace in her nightly conversations with Jon. In the candlelit confines of their tent, they allowed themselves the hope that if they took the city swiftly, with minimal bloodshed, they could usher in a new era of peace. Yet the secret of his parentage hovered at the edge of every conversation, a reminder of the precarious foundation upon which their dream rested. At last, the day dawned when the final lines were drawn. Tyrion's latest attempts to parley were rebuffed. The Golden Company's lines were clearly visible outside the gates, pikes bristling in the morning sun. Archers manned the walls, scorpions glinted on the ramparts. Daenerys' forces arrayed themselves in battle formation, unsullied in disciplined ranks, Dothraki riders shifting excitedly on their horses, northern bannermen standing alongside knights of the Vale. Drogon and Rhaegal hovered in the sky, casting massive shadows that rippled across the plain. Jon rode among the men, ghostly pale but resolute, while Daenerys ascended Drogon's back, heart pounding with the gravity of what she was about to do. The horns sounded. The clangor of steel on steel echoed as the armies advanced. A line of Lannister men broke from the gates, marching in tight formation, Golden Company banners snapping. Daenerys ordered the dragons to swoop low, unleashing a deafening roar but holding their fire for now. She hoped, in some corner of her soul, that the spectacle would break the enemy's resolve. But the Golden Company remained steady, well-paid professionals, loyal to their contract. The ground quaked with the thunder of hooves as the Dothraki launched the first charge. The Golden Company braced with their pikes, a deadly hedge that impaled the foremost riders. Screams filled the air, but the wave of Dothraki behind them smashed into the lines. Meanwhile, the Unsullied advanced at a quick step, shields locked, driving toward the Lannister flank. Northern archers fired volleys overhead, while scorpion bolts hissed from the city walls at the dragons. One bolt narrowly missed Rhaegal, who jerked aside, flames spewing from his maw as if in retaliation. Daenerys circled above the chaos, scanning for the scorpion crews. Drogon snarled beneath her, eager to unleash destruction. With a grim determination, she guided Drogon into a dive, releasing a concentrated stream of dragonfire onto a row of scorpions perched on the walls. The wood and iron contraptions exploded in flame, sending soldiers scurrying. The walls lit with a roar, black smoke curling upward. Below, the Golden Company formation began to buckle under the relentless Dothraki assault and the flanking charge of Unsullied. But more men poured forth from the city gates, and the clash intensified. Bodies piled up on both sides, the screams and clang of steel forming a harrowing symphony. Jon led a contingent of northern knights into the fray, Longclaw flashing. He cut down a Lannister bannerman, who tried to run him through, then parried another blow. Ser Davos, not the greatest fighter, but a steady presence, directed the men to press forward, aiming to reach the gates. The plan was to breach the city quickly if possible, to prevent a prolonged slaughter. But the gates were heavily defended, and the scorpions that remained on the ramparts fired intermittently, forcing Daenerys and Rhaegal to stay moving, lest they be skewered. Grey Worm and the Unsullied advanced with lethal precision, stepping over the fallen, their spears thrusting in unison. The Dothraki roared, riding in wide arcs, cutting down fleeing foes. Tyrion, from a vantage point behind the lines, watched the carnage with a pained expression. He prayed that the city would break sooner rather than later, sparing them all from a prolonged fight. The stench of blood and burning wood hung in the air, carried by a chill breeze from the sea. At a critical moment, a great rumble shook the ground. The city gates groaned open from within, and a fresh wave of Lannister cavalry emerged, charging into the flank of the Dothraki. For a moment, the tide seemed to turn, as horse and rider collided in a swirl of screams and flashing steel. Daenerys, seeing her people in trouble, dove low with Drogon, ignoring the scorpion bolts that whistled past. She let loose a swath of flame that forced the Lannister cavalry to scatter, their horses shrieking in terror. The sudden shift allowed the Dothraki to regroup, hacking down the disoriented riders. But a scorpion bolt found its mark, grazing Drogon's hind leg and causing him to roar in agony. Daenerys gasped, clutching the saddle as he lurched. She urged him upward, heart pounding, vowing not to let him fall again. Rhaegal soared overhead, unleashing gouts of flame on the ramparts, scattering the defenders. For a moment, it seemed the gateway might be clear. Jon, spotting the opportunity, urged his men forward, charging through the battered lines toward the entrance. The combined push of Northerners, Unsullied, and Dothraki forced a path to the gate. Lannister men-at-arms, seeing the dragons overhead and the unstoppable surge below, began to break rank. Some threw down their weapons. Others fled back inside the city, seeking the dubious safety of the narrow streets. At last, the gates fell, splintering under the assault, the heavy beams snapped by dragonfire and the ramming of a makeshift battering ram. With a tremendous crash, the way into King's Landing lay open, revealing a city in chaos. Smoke drifted through the air, the clash of steel echoing from alleyways as pockets of resistance formed. Civilians screamed, rushing to hide in their homes or flee deeper into the labyrinth of streets. Daenerys hovered above, scanning for scorpions or archers that might threaten her or the men below. Jon, Ser Davos, and Grey Worm led the vanguard into the city, calling for the Lannister soldiers to surrender. Some did, dropping their swords and kneeling. Others fought on, only to be cut down. Daenerys set Drogon down in a wide courtyard just inside the city walls, the heat of his breath scorching the cobblestones. She dismounted, heart pounding, and commanded a group of Unsullied to secure the area. Tyrion arrived moments later, panting as he dismounted from his horse. "We're inside, Your Grace, but Cersei may still have men on the streets, and scorpions hidden in the city." She nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. The day was cold, but the heat of battle made her burn. "We'll proceed carefully. No wanton destruction. Our fight is with Cersei and those who refuse to surrender." She gestured for the Unsullied to fan out, instructing them to allow civilians to pass unhurt. The streets of King's Landing were cramped, winding, and full of terrified screams. The stench of smoke and sewage clung to everything. Jon caught up to her near the plaza, Longclaw dripping with blood. Ghost padded at his side, muzzle red, flanks heaving. Jon's eyes were ablaze with the urgency of the fight. "We've broken through. Most of the Lannister men are throwing down their arms." Then his gaze shifted, scanning the city's sprawl. The Red Keep loomed in the distance, perched on its cliff above the Blackwater. "We need to make for the castle." Daenerys signaled to Drogon, who roared and took flight again, circling overhead to watch for traps. Rhaegal was engaged elsewhere, flaming a line of scorpions that had been set up along a street, if the plumes of smoke were any indication. Grey Worm, seeing the path open, rallied a detachment of Unsullied and Dothraki, forming a wedge aimed straight at the Red Keep. Tyrion and Davos followed, though Tyrion looked torn as he recognized the city of his youth in flames and chaos. Arya darted ahead of them, slipping through the streets like a ghost, intent on her own mission, no doubt to find Cersei. As they pressed deeper, the city's defenders melted away, many hurling aside their helmets and begging for mercy. Daenerys shouted for her men to hold their fire, to grant quarter if the foe surrendered. She could see the fear etched on every face. Small folk cowering in doorways, Lannister archers dropping their bows. For a fleeting moment, hope surged in her that this would end without the mass slaughter she had dreaded. Then, a thunderous explosion rattled the streets. Qyburn had apparently rigged several caches of wildfire throughout the city, meant to deter an invading army. A tower not far from the Street of Flower erupted in green flames, sending debris raining down. Daenerys felt the tremor from blocks away. The shockwave toppled men and horses alike, and soon more pockets of eerie green light flickered in other quarters. Screams filled the air as entire streets were consumed. The old terror of wildfire threatened to repeat the madness of her father. Desperate to prevent further destruction, Daenerys commanded Drogon to douse pockets of the green flame from above. His dragonfire clashed with the wildfire, producing swirling clouds of toxic smoke. Soldiers and civilians alike choked, trying to flee. Through it all, Daenerys pushed on, unwavering in her resolve to reach the Red Keep and force Cersei to stand down. Jon and Grey Worm led the ground assault, forging a path up the winding roads to the castle gates. Tyrion, face ashen, followed, muttering curses about Qyburn. The city seemed on the brink of unraveling entirely. At last, they reached the plaza before the Red Keep. The massive gates stood shut, scorpions placed atop the walls, manned by the last loyal defenders. From the battlements, they could see a glimpse of the royal standard, the golden lion on crimson. Daenerys dismounted Drogon in the open square, face set. She raised her voice, calling up to the walls. "Cersei Lannister, your forces have fallen. Surrender now, and you will be given a trial. Continue fighting, and the city will burn around you." For a long moment, there was no answer. Then a single figure appeared at the parapet. Qyburn, wrapped in his ominous robes. He shouted down, voice reedy and sharp. "Her Grace does not yield to usurpers. We have enough wildfire to blow the entire city sky high if you dare breach these walls. Withdraw now, or we will set it all aflame." A chill coursed through Daenerys. She recalled the Mad King's final threat: burn them all. She saw the fear on Tyrion's face, the grim set of Jon's jaw. If Cersei was truly mad enough to let Qyburn set off wildfire stores across the city, there might be no saving King's Landing from a cataclysm. The Red Keep's thick walls could shield some, but the rest of the city would be doomed. Daenerys clenched her fists, calling up again. "There are thousands of innocent people in these streets. Do you want them all to die for your vanity?" Qyburn's laughter carried across the plaza. "Her Grace rules by the will of the gods. If you and your dragons do not leave, she will see the city turn to ashes before surrendering it to a Targaryen." Jon cursed under his breath, stepping closer to Daenerys. "We must do something. We can't risk a breach if they have that much wildfire." And Tyrion's mind raced. Is there a way to infiltrate the Red Keep from below? The old tunnels? He glanced at Grey Worm. A small team might slip in, disable the caches, or capture Qyburn and force him to stand down. Daenerys stared at the walls, hearing the scorpions clank as they adjusted, waiting for the dragons to rise again. Drogon hissed, pacing behind her, the tip of his tail smashing cobblestones in agitation. "Yes," she said, adrenaline surging. "We must try a stealth approach. If we can remove Qyburn, we might force Cersei's hand. She can't ignite the wildfire on her own, can she?" "Me?" Tyrion pressed his lips tight. "She might have other loyal pyromancers, but Qyburn is the key. If he's gone, the plan might fall apart. And if we corner Cersei, she'll have no means to set the whole city ablaze by herself." Jon nodded. "We do it. Grey Worm, gather a small squad of Unsullied. Tyrion, show us the way in." So it was decided. Daenerys would remain in the plaza with Drogon, to deter any scorpion assault and maintain the threat that she could breach the gates if forced. Jon, Tyrion, and Grey Worm would lead a covert team through the labyrinth of tunnels that Tyrion remembered, aiming to come up within the Red Keep. Meanwhile, Rhaegal circled overhead, ensuring that the city remained under their control. Any sign that Qyburn was about to ignite the wildfire en masse, Daenerys would order a swift strike to breach the gates, come what may. Time was short. The plan was hastily formed, but every second they delayed put more civilians at risk. Tyrion led Jon, Grey Worm, and a handful of Unsullied to a narrow alley along the castle's flank, where an old drainage tunnel had once allowed waste to flow to the Blackwater. Now mostly sealed off, it took the combined strength of the Unsullied to pry open the rusted iron grate. The stench was foul, the darkness nearly absolute, but they pressed on, torches in hand. The winding passages dripped with foul water. Rats scurried away from the torchlight. Tyrion led them through stone corridors, occasionally glancing back with a grim expression, muttering about how Varys had once shown him these routes. They encountered minimal resistance at first, a few stray guards who were dispatched quietly by Grey Worm's men. But as they ascended a damp stairwell, the sound of heavy footsteps suggested that the defenders were aware of their presence. A tense melee erupted in a small corridor, scorpion bolts whizzing overhead. Jon swung Longclaw with lethal precision, cutting down a guard who tried to bar their way. Grey Worm thrust his spear into another, and the Unsullied formed a shield wall. Tyrion cowered behind them, though he carried a small dagger, his breath ragged from fear and exertion. Once the guards were dispatched, they pushed onward, the corridor leading to a small door that Tyrion recognized as opening into one of the Red Keep's lower hallways. Beyond that door lay the heart of the fortress, and Cersei, Qyburn, and the Wildfire's triggers. Jon signaled for silence. One of the Unsullied eased the door open. They emerged into a torchlit stone corridor, hearing the echo of voices and the shuffle of armed men. They pressed themselves against the walls. Tyrion pointed down a side passage. "That leads to Qyburn's laboratory," he whispered. "He might be there." Grey Worm nodded, leading two Unsullied forward. Jon and Tyrion crept behind them. The corridor opened into a dimly lit chamber that smelled of chemicals and rot. A cluster of large wooden casks stood near the far wall, each marked with the symbol of the Alchemist's Guild. Wildfire. Gooseflesh prickled on Jon's arms, and Tyrion's face went pale. Across the chamber, Qyburn stood flanked by a handful of guards. He clutched an odd contraption in his hands, a metal cylinder with a lever. At the sight of the intruders, Qyburn's eyes widened, and he let out a hiss. "You dare," he snarled. "One pull on this trigger and the city goes up in flames?" The guards rushed forward, but Grey Worm and the Unsullied clashed with them in a flurry of blades. Qyburn backpedaled, aiming to reach the casks. Jon lunged, vaulting over a fallen guard, trying to intercept Qyburn. Tyrion shouted a warning, but the chaos of steel and shouting filled the chamber. Qyburn brandished the trigger, his face twisted with fanatic glee. "I'll burn you all, burn you." He never finished. Arya Stark appeared behind him, silent as a shadow, her dagger finding the base of his skull with ruthless efficiency. Qyburn collapsed, the trigger slipping from his grasp. Arya grabbed it, eyes cold. The guards who remained quickly fell to the Unsullied spears. In the hush that followed, Jon panted, Longclaw dripping blood. Tyrion stared wide-eyed at the casks of wildfire, trembling at the nearness of cataclysm. Arya wiped her blade on Qyburn's robes. "He won't be burning anything now," she said tersely, handing the trigger to Jon. "Careful with that." Her gaze flicked to Tyrion. "You can thank me later." Jon exhaled a shaky breath. "Thank you, Arya. You may have saved half the city." Grey Worm nodded curtly. "We must find Cersei. Without Qyburn, she may still have other means, but her greatest threat is ended." Tyrion looked at the casks. "We'll need to secure these. One stray spark." He shuddered. "Let's move. The throne room is above." They hurried out of the chamber, leaving a small squad of Unsullied to guard the wildfire stores, ensuring no stray torches ignited a catastrophe. Arya led the way with swift silence, guiding them through the corridors. They encountered scattered pockets of resistance, but the men who saw them often dropped their weapons, demoralized by the news that Qyburn was dead and the city was overrun. Some simply fled. At last, they reached the grand staircase that led to the throne room, stepping over broken marble columns. Jon felt his heart pound with each step. He recalled Daenerys' vision, the ruin and ash. He prayed they would avoid that fate. At the entrance to the throne room, they found Cersei's last line of defense, the mountain silent and monstrous, with a handful of her Queensguard. Cersei stood behind them, robed in crimson, a mad gleam in her eyes. Tyrion stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture, trying one last time. "Cersei, it's over. Qyburn is dead. The city is taken. Surrender now and spare yourself a pointless death." She spat at his feet. "Traitor. I'll never surrender to that Targaryen whore. This is my throne, my city, and I'll see it destroyed before I hand it to her." And this end. The mountain roared in challenge, stepping forward. Arya lunged to meet him, but Jon pulled her back. "He's too strong," Jon growled, recalling how the mountain had nearly killed him once. Grey Worm and the Unsullied readied spears, but the mountain charged with preternatural strength, scattering men like rag dolls. Arya tried to dodge around him, but he swung a massive sword that nearly took her head off, forcing her back. The corridor erupted into a chaotic melee. Tyrion scrambled for cover as the Queensguard advanced. Jon met one guard's blade with Longclaw, steel ringing. In the swirl of fighting, Grey Worm seized a momentary opening and thrust his spear into the mountain's side, but the hulking knight barely staggered. He bashed Grey Worm aside with a gauntleted fist, sending him crashing into a wall. Arya darted in low, slashing at the mountain's legs, but her dagger barely pierced the thick armor. The mountain swung downward. Jon roared, intercepting with Longclaw, and the force of the blow nearly drove him to his knees. It felt like fighting an undead giant again, implacable, unstoppable. Meanwhile, Tyrion dodged a Queensguard strike, picking up a fallen sword. He was no swordsman, but desperation fueled him. He swiped at the guard's knees. The guard kicked him away, raising a blade for a killing blow, only for Arya to flick her dagger into his neck, saving Tyrion's life. Blood spurted as the guard collapsed. The corridor was thick with dust and the clangor of steel. Cersei stood behind the carnage, eyes flickering with hate. "Kill them all!" she shrieked at the mountain. Jon struggled to hold the monstrous knight's attention, giving Arya a chance to strike. He feinted high, and the mountain crashed his sword onto Jon's blade. The vibration nearly tore Longclaw from Jon's grip. In that split second, Arya darted in, aiming for a gap in the mountain's helmet. But the giant knight sensed her. His free hand lashed out, grabbing Arya by the throat and lifting her off the ground. She gasped, dropping her dagger. Jon bellowed in rage, hacking at the mountain's arm, but the armor was too thick. Arya's face turned red, her legs kicking frantically. Then came a deafening roar, like the sound of a breaking dam. The doors behind Cersei burst inward, revealing Daenerys Targaryen striding forward, flanked by more Unsullied. She had found another entrance, presumably, or broken through. Her eyes blazed at the sight of Arya choking. "Dracarys!" she shouted, and Drogon's massive head thrust into the corridor from behind her, maw opening. A torrent of flame engulfed the mountain, who still held Arya in a death grip. The heat was instantaneous, searing the corridor, forcing Jon to shield his face. The mountain howled, releasing Arya, who dropped to the ground, gasping for breath. The monstrous knight staggered, flames licking his armor, revealing charred flesh beneath. He stumbled once, twice, then collapsed in a blackened heap. Cersei recoiled, shielding her face from the heat. Daenerys advanced, chest heaving, eyes locked on the queen who had caused so much suffering. "It's over, Cersei," Daenerys hissed. "And this." Tears streaked the dust on Cersei's face, but her eyes were cold with loathing. "You think you've won?" She reached into her robes, producing a small phial of green liquid, wildfire. Before she could hurl it at the ground, Grey Worm's spear struck her arm, causing her to drop it harmlessly. It shattered on the marble floor, but without a spark. It merely hissed and fizzled. Cersei gasped in pain, blood trickling from where the spear had nicked her. She sank to her knees, clutching her arm. Daenerys stood over her, breathing hard, Drogon's hot breath gusting behind them. A hush settled, broken only by the crackle of distant fires. Cersei Lannister knelt in the place she had once ruled, her city taken, her monstrous champion slain. Jon, Tyrion, Arya, and Grey Worm surrounded her, weapons at the ready. Daenerys stared down at the woman who had refused every offer of peace, who had tried to unleash wildfire on her own people, who had threatened the entire realm for the sake of her pride. Cersei's lips curled in a final sneer. Go on, Targaryen. Burn me. Prove to the world you're just like your father. Daenerys closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling. The memory of the House of the Undying Vision flickered through her mind, the ash or snow drifting in the ruined throne room. She opened her eyes again, shaking but with resolve. No, she said, her voice steady. I am not my father. You will stand trial for your crimes, and the realm will see justice done. Tyrion, place her in custody. Tyrion stared at his sister, eyes brimming with conflicting emotion. Then he gestured to Grey Worm and the Unsullied, who seized Cersei, binding her wrists. She spat and cursed, but had no strength left to resist. Daenerys stepped back, relief and exhaustion flooding her in equal measure. Arya rubbed her bruised throat, gaze dark as she regarded Cersei. Jon lowered Longclaw, the tension in his shoulders releasing. For the first time, it seemed possible that King's Landing might be spared an endless bloodbath. Outside, the city smoldered from pockets of wildfire. Soldiers chased down the last of the resistance. But the overwhelming majority of Lannister forces had surrendered or fled, leaving King's Landing in the hands of Daenerys Targaryen, Jon Snow, and their allies. Bells began to toll, uncertain at first, then growing louder, echoing across the spires and streets, a sign of the city's capitulation, a funeral knell for the reign of Cersei Lannister. Daenerys turned to Jon, heart pounding in her chest. His eyes met hers, filled with relief, gratitude, and something deeper, a reflection of their vow to make this world better. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. We did it, she whispered, without burning it all. Jon sheathed Longclaw. We did. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, the tumult of secrets and war swirling in his eyes. Now we have to rebuild. They walked together into the throne room, stepping over broken doors and debris. Once again, Daenerys recalled that haunting vision of the place in ruins. The grand windows were shattered, letting in the wan afternoon sun. She moved forward, passing the scattered remains of the court, and approached the Iron Throne, a twisted mass of swords hammered into a seat. This was the symbol of power in the Seven Kingdoms, the seat her ancestors had forged through dragonfire. She stood before it, hesitating, uncertain. All her life had led her to this moment, but the horrors of war made it feel heavy, tainted. Jon, standing beside her, watched her with quiet reverence. Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, Arya, and the others gathered behind. The city's bells continued to toll. Daenerys lifted a hand, her fingertips lightly brushing the cold steel of the throne's arm. She remembered her brother's madness, her father's cruelty, the vow she had made to break the wheel of tyranny. A hush fell over the hall, the only sound the faint crackle of distant fires. Then, slowly, Daenerys turned away from the throne, facing the gathered survivors, her eyes moving over Jon, her advisors, her soldiers. The words came quietly at first, but gathered strength. We came here to free the realm from tyranny, she said, to break the chains that bound innocent people to cruel rulers. The Iron Throne is a symbol of conquest, of subjugation through blood and fire. If we do not change the way we rule, we will become what we hate. Her gaze lingered on Jon, remembering the night they learned of his parentage, of the Targaryen legacy they shared. Let this be the start of a new age, she continued, voice trembling with emotion. One where the people of the Seven Kingdoms are not pawns in a game of thrones, but citizens with rights and voices. I claim this throne not to sit above all, but to serve the realm. She glanced at Tyrion, who nodded in cautious agreement. We will hold a council of lords and ladies to determine how we govern from this day forward. Cersei Lannister will stand trial for her crimes. I promise a fair proceeding, so that all may see the difference between justice and revenge. Then, Tyrion cleared his throat, stepping forward. Let it be so. The city is ours. We must begin healing it. Our queen has spoken. No more tyranny. Grey Worm bowed his head. We follow you, my queen. Jon stood quietly, a hint of a smile touching his lips. He heard, beneath her words, the resolution that had driven them both from the moment they met, the determination to protect life, not merely claim power. She had turned away from the Iron Throne in a moment of ultimate temptation, and that spoke louder than any vow. Stepping toward Daenerys, Jon dropped to one knee, as he once had on a different shore. "My queen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our queen." She reached out, raising him up. Their eyes locked, sharing a private understanding of the secret that lay between them, of the promise they had made to reshape the realm. He stood, and she took his hand, turning to face the uncertain future. The bells tolled, echoing through the throne room as if to ring in a new era. Cersei's reign had ended. War had come to King's Landing, but had not consumed it entirely. There would be trials, repercussions, heartbreak yet to face. But for that single, exhaled moment, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow could believe in the dawn of a better day. And so the city stood, battered but unbroken, the throne room awash in sunlight rather than ash, as a queen born of fire and a king born of ice looked out upon a realm they had both vowed to save. If destiny itself was a tapestry woven from the threads of blood, magic, and love, then this was the moment a new pattern emerged. And the realm, though uncertain and scarred, stood on the cusp of a tomorrow forged by unity instead of fear.